What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. What you're about to hear is the conclusion of The Warriors, a 3-part series on the epic journey of Xenophon's 10,000. If you haven't heard the first 2 parts yet, I strongly recommend you go back and do that first before you listen to this one. Only a Persian would listen to these out of order. And well, I guess I have to apologize for taking so long to get this 3rd part of the series out. It's taken me a lot longer than I expected to put together, and part of that is because I had forgotten how complicated the story gets after the Greeks make it to Trapezus. This really is the most complex part of the story with the most intrigue, and it's not the kind of ending you might expect from the Hollywood movie version of this story, but you'll see when we get there. Anyway, the point is, sorry it's taken me so long, but it's here now, as promised. As soon as this goes out, I'll be back to doing the research for the Mormon series, and I'll also be resuming the series of Book of Mormon summary articles I've been doing on Substack. I'm about halfway through that, and it's been on hiatus for a little bit while I finish this series up, but I'll be getting back to that too. It will definitely take me a while to actually start putting out episodes of the Mormon series because I've only just gotten started on the research for that. I don't have anything else planned between now and then, so the Unsung Podcast is going to be out of season for a bit, you might say. But I will be back with the Mormon series soon enough. If you appreciate this show and you'd like to support me, you can become a paid subscriber on Substack for $5 a month or $50 a year. You can make a one-time donation through PayPal or Venmo if you want to. You can pick up one of the 3 audiobooks I now have published. The latest one of them is Frank Kidd's Once Upon a Time in Argentina. You can also subscribe to my other podcast that I do with John, son of Dick. That's called Charlie Horse Radio. And it's more of a conversational type show with guests that we do twice a month on Southern history and culture. Links to all of those things are in the show notes, so with that being said, here is the conclusion of The Warriors.
Well, you're gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie? I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them, fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
Have you ever worked on some major project before? Doesn't really matter what kind of project. It could be building something, it could be academic, it could be some kind of creative, artistic, or professional endeavor, maybe writing a novel. It could even be maybe an 11-part podcast series on the Kansas-Missouri border war, for example. The important part is, it has to be something that took you a pretty good chunk of time, at least months or maybe even years, and it has to be something you got really invested in and cared a lot about doing well on. How did it feel when you completed that project? Well, first, there's an incredible sense of accomplishment in finishing something like that. Especially if you truly feel in the end that you gave it your all and produced the best end product that you could have. You left it all on the field, so to speak. But there's another feeling that often comes along with finishing a project like this. That sense of accomplishment doesn't last forever. It might last a few days or a few weeks, a few months, or maybe even a few years, depending on the exact nature of the project, how long it took you to finish, your personal temperament, any number of other factors. But however long it lasts, it's almost guaranteed to go away eventually, and what replaces it is often a more complicated feeling. You've poured your heart and soul into this thing for months or years or however long it's been, and now it's gone. It can feel like a hangover almost, or like coming down from some kind of high. There can be a sense of loss, at the very least the loss of that thing that's been filling up so much of your time and energy lately. You can feel a little bit lost, even start to feel a little bit depressed. Well, now imagine that this project you've been working on for the last, let's say, 6 months, isn't just some kind of creative or professional endeavor, but a literal fight for your very life. That's what these Greeks had been doing, and it's what they had just completed, more or less, when they marched into Trapezus on the coast of the Black Sea in about May of 400 BC. Xenophon writes in his Anabasis, quote, "They stayed at Trapezus for about 30 days in the Colchois villages, which they used as bases from which to plunder Colchian territory. The Trapezuntans provided an ongoing market for the encamped army, and they received the Greeks hospitably, giving them as tokens of their friendship cattle and barley meal and wine. They also undertook negotiations on behalf of those Colchoi who lived nearby, for the most part in the plain. These too gave the Greeks cattle as tokens of friendship." End quote. Now, if I'm feeling this post-project come-down from a history podcast series, I can only imagine how much more intense it might have been for the soldiers in this army. Relief after 6 hard months of constant marching and fighting, with another 6 months or so of hard marching before that leading up to Cunaxa. The pressure was taken off. That singular goal in everyone's minds of making it to the sea and surviving was no longer there, and it remained to be seen how the army would react to having that pressure taken off. The primary concern in the back of everyone's minds during that 30 days at Trapezus had to have been, now what? We still have a ways to go to get back to Greece proper. How are we going to get there? Well, the soldiers had an answer. Xenophon writes, quote, "The Greeks held an assembly and started discussing the remainder of the journey. First to stand up was Anteleon of Thurii, and what he had to say himself was this." Quoting Anteleon now, "Now, men, I for one am already tired of packing up my kit and traveling on foot and running and bearing arms and keeping in formation and doing guard duty and fighting, and what I long for now is to have no more of these troubles, since we have reached the sea, and instead to sail the rest of the way and arrive in Greece stretched out at my ease, like Odysseus." Back to Xenophon. When they heard this, the soldiers shouted out in an uproar that he spoke rightly, and someone else started to make a speech on the same lines, as indeed did everyone who came forward. Next, Chrysophos stood up and said, quoting Chrysophos now, "Men, I have a friend called Anaxibios who happens to be the current Nauarchos. So if you send me to him, I think I would come back both with triremes and with merchant ships to ferry us. If you do indeed want to go by sea, wait until I come back. I will be quick." Back to Xenophon. When they heard this, the soldiers were pleased and voted for him to set sail as soon as possible. End quote. Chrysophos set off on his mission to bring back ships, and while he was gone, Xenophon set about planning for contingencies. He assembled the army and told them that, first off, they would need to provide for their food while they waited. Trapezus was being friendly in providing them with a market to buy food, but remember they hadn't gotten paid in at least 6 months, so they didn't have a lot of money to buy food with. They would instead need to continue plundering the territory of the Colchoi and other surrounding tribes. They would also need to provide security for their camp, since the tribes were not likely to take kindly to being plundered and could always retaliate. And then Xenophon warned the soldiers of the uncomfortable possibility that Chrysophos wouldn't ever return with ships. Remember, he mentioned that his friend Anaxibios was the current Nauarchos. That meant he was the chief admiral of the Spartan fleet for that year, and he was based in Byzantium, right at the mouth of the Black Sea and not terribly far away from Trapezus by ship. But at this point, we don't really know anything about this Anaxibios or his relationship with Chrysophos. As far as anybody knew, it was entirely possible that he'd be either unwilling or unable to provide the ships Chrysophos was going to ask him for, or that he'd be able to provide some ships but not enough to transport the whole army. Then there was the possibility that something could happen to Chrysophos on the way. Like I said before, it wasn't a terribly long voyage, but still, sea travel was hazardous back then, 1800 years before the classical age of sail really took off. Anything could happen, and Xenophon thought it best to prepare for the worst, so he argued to the soldiers that they should start trying to build a fleet on their own if they could. And the way they would do that is to try to get the Trapezuntans to loan them a couple of ships of war, and then basically become pirates for a bit, capturing merchant ships in the Black Sea as they went by on their trade routes. And then, I find this kind of funny, but during his speech to the soldiers, Xenophon says this about the ships they'll take in these piracy operations, quote, "And consider whether it is not right for us to maintain from our common fund those whom we may force to land, during the time they have to wait on our account, and whether we shouldn't also establish a price that will pay for being transported. That way, by helping us, they too will gain a benefit." End quote. So we're going to become pirates and start capturing merchant ships, but it's okay because we'll make sure their crews benefit too. But there was even a further contingency, which the soldiers really didn't want to hear about, but Xenophon spoke about anyway. That was the possibility that Chrysophos wouldn't come back with any ships, and the army wouldn't be able to collect enough ships on their own to transport all of them. In that case, if they were to continue on the journey home, they'd have no choice but to go by land. The soldiers didn't want to think about that, as they were tired of marching and wanted to take the easy way home by sea, but even so, Xenophon started talks with the surrounding cities to try to get them to start repairing the parts of the coastal road that were in disrepair. He told them that there was a possibility they'd be forced to go by land, and told the cities that the better the roads are, the sooner you'll be rid of us, so it's in your best interest to get them in as good of shape as you can. Almost immediately, you can see the cracks starting to form in the army. The Greeks succeeded in getting a ship from the Trapezuntans, a pentaconter. This was a 50-oared warship that was kind of outdated for this time. The up-to-date one would have been the trireme, which had 3 banks of oars per side, while the pentaconter had 1. But they got a pentaconter from the Trapezuntans and put a Laconian named Dexippos in charge of it. And Dexippos, instead of starting to capture merchant ships according to the plan, took his new pentaconter and deserted the army, sailing right out of the Black Sea. Xenophon makes sure to tell us that this Dexippos didn't get very far. He got what he deserved when he was killed in Thrace a short time later. Fortunately for the army, though, they also got another outdated warship, this one a smaller ship of 30 oars, and put it under the command of a Polycrates of Athens. This time, Polycrates did carry out the plan of capturing merchant ships, and the Greeks started building up their transport fleet. While the fleet was being built, the army continued plundering the surrounding tribes for their food. They eventually got to a point where they'd pretty much done plundered everything within half a day's march of their camp, meaning that it would no longer be possible to send out plundering raids and have them return to camp the same day. They would have to venture out farther if they wanted to keep eating. At this point, Xenophon requested the help of the Trapezuntans to guide him to some further out tribes who still had food to take. And this is also the point where we start to see again a dynamic that we saw at the end of the last episode with the city of Gymnias, and that we'll see plenty more of throughout the rest of this story. See, for the trip from Tissaphernes' betrayal to the Black Sea, the Greeks had pretty much been marching through completely hostile territory the whole time. There'd been a couple notable exceptions to that, especially as they got closer to Trapezus, but for the most part, it holds true for that part of the journey. But it was no longer the case now. They were back in the neighborhood of some Greek colonies, the first of which was, of course, Trapezus, and that meant that not everybody was openly hostile to them anymore. That came with some obvious benefits, like the hospitality of Trapezus and the prospect of being able to get at least some of their food supplies without plundering, but it also came with some complications. Namely, they would almost inevitably become involved in political games in a way they really hadn't been since Cyrus died. You have to remember this was a seriously formidable army. We said in the last episode that maybe their most important edge against the Persians was their reputation. Well, they had definitely not lost that. In fact, if anything, their reputation was probably enhanced by the fact that they'd just finished this epic march out of the heart of Persia. Besides that, they were a large army numerically for that time and place, despite the fact that their numbers had been bled down significantly from the original 13,000 or so. They still had close to 10,000 combat troops, and it was not common to see armies of that size in warfare among Greek city-states of this era. This army would have been pretty big even by Peloponnesian war standards, and for the neighborhood of a bunch of outlying Greek colonies not engaged in such a giant catastrophic war, they were by far the biggest organized force around. And even besides their numbers, think of their experience. Many of these guys were already veterans of the Peloponnesian War when they started on the campaign with Cyrus. Then on top of that, they went through the crucible of Cunaxa and the following 6-month march out of Persia, fighting constantly the whole way. To call this army battle-hardened would be the understatement of the century, maybe. If nobody on the Black Sea coast could come close to matching their numbers, they were even further away from matching them in combat experience as a unit. The reason all this is important is that as we go forward in the story from here, the Greeks and related peoples on the Black Sea coast, starting with the Trapezuntans, will seem to pick up on all of it and what it means. Just like the people of Gymnias in the last episode, they will start to realize what has just dropped into their laps. Just by virtue of their sheer force capability, this army of mercenaries will now by default become a player in the politics of this whole region, whether they want to be or not. And like I was saying a minute ago, the fact that not everybody is openly hostile to them anymore will expand the possibilities of what that political involvement looks like. This is exactly what we're about to see with these Trapezuntian guides showing Xenophon who to plunder. Because it turns out that the Greeks hadn't quite plundered everybody near their camp. There were some nearby tribes left intact, but the problem was those tribes were friends of the city of Trapezus, which meant the Greeks kind of had to leave them alone if they wanted to stay on the Trapezuntians' good side, which they did. So the guides led Xenophon further out on a raiding expedition against a different tribe called the Dreli, who were enemies of Trapezus. So again, could very well be a case of the Trapezuntians kind of taking advantage of this situation and using this formidable army to hurt one of their enemies. But Xenophon could only take half the army with him on this expedition. They were just going out on a raid. They weren't moving permanently, which meant they still had a camp to protect, and let's just say they'd made some enemies among the Kolkhoi in their time camping outside Trapezus. So Xenophon left half the army behind to guard the camp and marched with the other half into Dreli territory, which was a bit inland and back up in the mountains in similar rugged terrain to where they'd fought the Kardikoi. Now, I'll read you Xenophon's own account of this because there's an interesting point I want to make about it later, and it'll help if you've heard this in full. He writes, quote, "When the Greeks were in the high country, they found that the Dreli had gone away, having first set fire to all their strongholds that had seemed to them easy to capture, and there was nothing for the Greeks to take except the odd pig, ox, or other animal that had escaped from the fire. But there was one stronghold that was their main settlement, into which they had all streamed together. Around this lay an extremely deep ravine, and the routes across it to the stronghold were difficult to traverse. The Peltasts had run on, about 2/3 of a mile ahead of the hoplites, and crossed the ravine, and seeing a great deal of livestock and other signs of wealth, they proceeded to attack the stronghold. Along with them there also followed a throng of spearmen who had set out hastily, intent on obtaining the expected food supplies, and so the number of those who had crossed the ravine amounted to more than about 1,000 people. But despite all their fighting, they could not capture the stronghold, for there was also a broad trench, and, piled up behind it, an earth rampart with stakes set on the top and wooden towers constructed at frequent intervals. So they began to try to retreat instead, but the enemy kept pressing them. Since they could not run off because they could make the descent from the stronghold to the ravine only in single file, they sent for Xenophon, who was leading the hoplites. On reaching Xenophon, the messenger said, 'The place is full of a great deal of wealth, but we can't capture it. It's too strong. And it's not easy to get away either, for they have come out against us and are putting up a fight, and the escape route is difficult.' When he heard this, Xenophon went forward to the ravine and ordered the hoplites to halt under arms, while he himself crossed over with the captains and spent some time working out whether it would be better to lead back the troops who had already crossed the ravine or to take the hoplites across it too, with the idea that in that way the stronghold might be captured. Retreat seemed impossible without incurring many fatal casualties. The captains, for their part, thought they could take the place, and Xenophon himself agreed with their opinion. This was because he put his confidence in the sacred signs from the sacrificers, for the seers had made clear that while there would be a battle, the outcome of the expedition would be an honorable one. He sent the captains back to bring over the hoplites, while he himself stayed where he was, having made every one of the Peltasts draw back, and he did not allow any of them even to throw a javelin from a distance. When the hoplites arrived, he ordered each of the captains to deploy his company in the way he thought would make it fight most effectively, since the captains positioned close to one another on this occasion were ones who used to vie with each other the whole time in the behavior befitting to a man. They set about deploying their companies while Xenophon gave instructions to all the Peltasts to advance with fingers through the throwing loop, as it would be necessary to throw their javelins at the exact moment he gave the signal. Likewise, the archers were to have their arrows on the bowstrings, as it would also be necessary for them to shoot at the exact moment he gave the signal, and the light-armed were to have their slings primed with stones, and he sent suitable officers to see to these arrangements. When everything was ready, the captains and their lieutenants and those who thought themselves to be as good as their officers were all drawn up together, and indeed could see each other clearly, since they were in a crescent formation because of the nature of the ground. After they had sung the war hymn and the trumpet sounded, the hoplites simultaneously raised the battle cry to Enyalios and set off at a run while the missiles began to fly. Lances, arrows, slingshot pellets, and a very large number of stones thrown by hand. Some people even used firebrands. Under the impact of the huge quantity of missiles, the enemy left the stockade and its towers, and so Agasias of Stymphalos and Philoxenos of Pellene put aside their body armor and shields and, clad only in their tunics, climbed up the stockade. And then the soldiers set about drawing each other up, and soon yet others had climbed up without aid, and the place had been captured, or so it seemed. Both the peltast and the lighter-armed troops ran in, and each individual began to seize whatever he could, but Xenophon stood by the gates and kept outside as many of the hoplites as he could, because more of the enemy were starting to appear on various easily defensible heights. Not much time had passed when loud shouting was heard from inside, and soldiers came fleeing out, some managing to carry what they had taken, but soon one or two were wounded, and there was much jostling about the gateways. When they were questioned, the troops stumbling out all said that inside was a citadel, where there were large numbers of the enemy, who ran out and rained blows on the crowd of people inside the stockade. Thereupon, Xenophon ordered Talmides the herald to announce that anyone who wanted any plunder should make his way inside. Many did indeed rush inside, overcoming those stumbling out of the gates by pushing their way in and once more bottling up the enemy in the citadel. Everything outside the citadel was systematically plundered and carried off by the Greeks, and the hoplites took up position, some by the stockade, others on the road leading to the citadel. Xenophon and the captains kept on the lookout to see if it might be possible to capture the citadel, for in that way they would be secure, and unless they did so, to withdraw seemed to be extremely difficult. However, on considering the matter, they came to the conclusion that the place was completely impregnable. Thereupon they began to prepare their retreat, and each unit proceeded to pull down the palisade in his vicinity. The captains set about sending away the troops who were ineffective and heavily laden, indeed the majority of the hoplites. They held back only those in whom each officer had confidence. When they started to retreat, many tribesmen began running out from inside to attack them, armed with lances and wickerwork shields and wearing greaves and Paphlagonian helmets, while others began to climb up onto the tops of the houses on each side of the track leading up to the citadel, and hence it was not safe to mount a pursuit as far as the gates leading into the citadel. Furthermore, the enemy was throwing great logs down from above, so that there were difficulties for the Greeks whether they retreated or stood their ground. In addition, the approach of night alarmed them. But as they fought on, at a loss as to what to do, some god gave them a means of salvation. All of a sudden, one of the houses on their right blazed up, someone or other having set it on fire. As it was falling in, the enemy began to flee from the houses on the right. Good fortune made Xenophon aware of this, and he ordered the troops to set the houses on the left on fire as well. The houses were made of wood, so they burned especially quickly, and the enemy therefore began to flee from these houses too. The enemy facing them were now the only ones still causing trouble, and they were clearly going to attack the Greeks as they withdrew and in their subsequent descent. Hence Xenophon gave instructions that whoever happened to be beyond the range of the missiles was to get to work carrying logs into the middle ground between themselves and the enemy. When there were enough logs, they set them on fire, and they also proceeded to set fire to the houses by the palisade itself, in order that the enemy might be preoccupied with them. By thus creating a belt of fire between themselves and the enemy, they made their way out of the place, though not without difficulty. The whole city was burned down, houses, towers, stockade, and everything else except the citadel. On the next day, the Greeks went away with the food supplies they had captured. But since they were worried about the descent to Trapezes, which was steep and narrow, they set a fake ambush. To do this, one man, a Mysian by race and Misos by name, took 14 or 15 of the Cretans and stayed behind in a dense thicket, where he pretended to try to escape the enemy's notice, while the detachment's light shields, being bronze, gleamed through now and then. The enemy, seeing this through the undergrowth, were afraid that it was an ambush, and meanwhile the army proceeded to make its descent. When it seemed that they had already gone far enough, Xenophon signaled to the Mysian to flee with all his might, whereupon he stood up and fled, together with his comrades. The others, the Cretans, because, as they said, they would certainly be captured if they just ran, turned out of the track into the woods and saved themselves by tumbling down through the wooded hollows there, but the Mysian fled down the track, shouting for help. And they did come and help him, and picked him up, wounded. Those who had come to help him then proceeded to retreat in their turn, step by step, without turning their backs and under a hail of missiles, while some of the Cretans returned the enemy's arrow fire. In this way, they all arrived safe back in the camp. End quote. So this assault on the stronghold of the Dreli on its own could be an epic movie, right? It was quite a hard-fought battle, but in the end, the Greeks got the food they needed, and the Trapezuntans got to punish their enemies, the Dreli. But this little episode also revealed something to Xenophon and the other Greek leadership, which was that staying in their camp outside Trapezus was no longer a viable option. There just wasn't anybody near them left to plunder, not without going up into the mountains on an expedition like this one, and as we'll see in a minute, if they kept having to make assaults like that for their food, they wouldn't have much of an army for long. So they had to move. But Chrysophos wasn't back with the ships yet, and they didn't have anywhere near enough merchant ships collected from the piracy to transport the whole army. So as much as the soldiers might have hated it, they were going to have to march out again, at least down the coast a ways to a new camp at a new city, hopefully with new enemy tribes nearby that they could plunder for food without having to mount major expeditions like the one against the Dreli. They loaded the sick, the wounded, and as many of the non-combatants as they could onto the ships they did have and set off to the west, marching 3 days to the city of Chrysois, another Greek colony on the Black Sea coast. Xenophon says they only stayed at Chrysois for 10 days, and then he gives us another kind of shocking glimpse into the toll this campaign has been taking, in particular this latest assault on the Dreli. Quote, "A review under arms was held there, and a head count was taken, in which there turned out to be 8,600 troops. These were the survivors. The others had perished at the hands of the enemy, or because of the snow, or in a few cases through disease." End quote. Now the reason that's kind of shocking is that, first of all, remember we started with around 13,000 Greeks in this army. Now we're down to 8,600, which means something like 1/3 of the original number was dead by this point. The part that's maybe even more shocking is that of those 4,400 dead, about 1,200, or 27%, had been killed since reaching Trapezus. So during the whole march from Cunaxa to the Black Sea, over 6 months of desperate fighting, the Greeks lost about 3,200 men. You get that from the 9,800 number Xenophon gives in that final battle with the Kolkoi. Then the Greeks lost another 1,200 men in just 1 month, after reaching what's really supposed to be a safer region. There's a fair number of things that can account for those losses. They were plundering people, maybe getting attacked by some of the bolder Kolkoi from time to time. They had that one desertion by Dexippos with the ship that might have taken a few men. Various other skirmishes. But my Landmark edition has a section in one of the appendices that talks about this, and they argue there that there's really nothing that can account for the bulk of those 1,200 casualties besides this expedition against the Dreli. They say, assume a couple hundred of those casualties happened elsewhere, and that Xenophon lost 1,000 men in the Dreli expedition. Then consider the fact that he only took half of the army with him. Half of the army would have been about 4,800 to 4,900 men, give or take, and based on those assumptions, Xenophon lost more than 1/5 of his force in that one expedition, not to mention accounting for more than 1/5 of the total casualties for the entire campaign so far. Looking at it this way, this little excursion against the Dreli starts to look something like a total disaster for the army. And the interesting question is, think back to the account I just read directly from Xenophon about this expedition and ask yourself, would you get the idea that the expedition was a disaster just from a face value reading of that? I think not. I think you'd kind of have to read between the lines a little bit, think about the timeline and do a little math. And I'm far from the first one to say this, but you get the sense that maybe Xenophon is, let's say, underemphasizing the scale of the disaster in this expedition because he was the one in command of it. But at the end of the day, it's no wonder they decided to move camp after that. Now, one final little wrinkle I'll throw into the picture here is that I've been a little sloppy with my terms. I've been using the terms casualty and death kind of interchangeably, Those terms are not interchangeable. Properly speaking, casualties means not just killed, but killed, wounded, captured, and missing. But it's not just me being sloppy. It can sometimes be a little unclear to me when Xenophon talks about losses, whether he's talking strictly about the dead or whether he's also talking about, for example, wounded who've been incapacitated and are temporarily or permanently out of commission. And maybe there were some wounded who got on the ships with the non-combatants and therefore weren't counted in this roll call at Charasoas. Whatever the case may be, it's safe to say these were significant losses for this army. Xenophon doesn't really give us much of a glimpse into anyone's state of mind, but you have to wonder if this shook the army's confidence at all. Had they lost their edge over this period of R&R at Trapezus? Were they getting sloppy? Had Xenophon just made a bad call leading them against the Dreli in the first place? One wonders. One thing was for certain, though. Chrysophos was still nowhere to be seen with the ships he'd promised, and without ships it was still going to be a hell of a long march back to their homes. The army didn't stay in Charasoas for long, which Xenophon doesn't really explain much, but it could be there just wasn't enough to eat in that neighborhood, wasn't enough opportunity for plunder, so they decided to move on. They kept going west along the coastline into the territory of a new people, the Masanichi. I find this next section kind of funny, so I'm going to read a little bit of it. Before I do, you're going to hear the word proxenos in this quote. If you remember from part 1, there was a guy named Proxenos who was a friend of Xenophon and was killed by Tissaphernes, but here Proxenos is a title or a position. There's going to be a guy who is a Proxenos of the Masanichi at Trapezus, and that just means he's a Trapezuntine citizen appointed to act as the representative of the Masanichi in his own city. Kind of like an ambassador, maybe. So anyway, Xenophon writes, quote, "When they were on the frontier with the Masanichi, they sent to them Timesitheos, a Trapezuntian and a Proxenos of the Masanichi at Trapezus, asking whether they would be making their way through friendly or hostile territory. The Masanichi replied that they would not let them pass through, for they trusted in their strongholds. At this point, Timesitheos said that the tribesmen on the far side of these people, also Masanichi, were enemies of theirs, and the Greeks decided to invite them over to see whether they might want to enter into an alliance. Timesitheos was sent to them and came back, bringing their leaders with him." End quote. So just to track what's going on and why I find it kind of funny, this Timesitheos doesn't ask permission. He just tells the Masanichi that the Greeks are coming through and asks if it's going to be with or without a fight. The Masanichi respond that, maybe they feel like having a fight today and they're not going to let him through. Xenophon doesn't explain at all why they don't want to let him through, but maybe if they just asked permission instead of demanding, they'd have gotten a friendlier response. This is one of those times when I'd just love to have more information about the political situation between Trapezus and the Masanichi to get a better idea of what the dynamics are here, but we don't get that. But anyway, it gets better because then Timesitheos says, hey, there's this other tribe, or maybe clan or something, of Masanichi on the far side, who don't like these guys right here in front of us. Maybe we can ally with them. So just picture the coastline running east to west with the Black Sea on the north side and the land on the south side, sea on the Greeks' right hand as they advance to the west. And picture the Masanichi kind of spread out along the seacoast for the next little bit. The ones on the eastern end that the Greeks meet first decide they're going to be hostile, but Timesitheos says the ones on the far side, the western end, are hostile to these eastern ones, so maybe they can make an alliance. Then he just walks through Masanichi territory to go link up with them, and apparently this works because the western Masanichi leaders actually come back with him. When Xenophon made his sales pitch to the western Masanichi leaders for this, he made use of the fact that the Greeks, despite their recent losses, had the most formidable army for miles around. He said, hey look, you hate these guys, we have a powerful army, you're probably not going to get a better chance than this to hurt them. The western Masanichi agreed to this and said they would send an attack against the opposite side of the eastern Masanichi, as well as sending some men down the coast by canoe to join the Greeks and fight alongside them from the eastern side. It turned out that there was one particular stronghold currently in the hands of the eastern Masanichi that was sort of the main city of all the Masanichi, and they all recognized that whoever held that city held the authority over all of Masanichi territory. So this is the place the Westerners mostly wanted to capture when they sent men over to join the Greeks. Xenophon says they arrived by canoe decked out in full battle dress and immediately launched a kind of chaotic assault against the place that failed. Then the next day, the Greeks led a more properly ordered and disciplined assault that carried the place and cleared their path through Masanichi territory. Xenophon says they spent a total of 8 days marching through Masanichi territory, then another 2 days going through the territory of another new people called the Tissaphernes, until they made it to the city of Katyura, another Greek colony on the Black Sea coast. And here we get a little update that's assumed to be a scribal insertion in the manuscripts, which says, quote, "Up to this point, the army had traveled by land. There had been 122 days' worth of marching in the journey down from the battle in Babylon as far as Katyura, amounting to 620 parasangs, or rather more than 2,000 miles. They had spent 8 months on the journey." End quote. 2,000 miles sounds like an overstatement of how far the march had been, given that the total distance from Cunaxa back to Sardis was something like 1,000 miles, and the distance from Cunaxa to the Black Sea something like 400 miles, like we said in the last episode. And it might be an overstatement, but probably not by as much as you'd think, because remember those distances I gave were straight line distances, as the crow flies, right? But now we're talking about marching distance, and obviously the Greeks couldn't march in a straight line. They had to follow the course of rivers, go up and down and around mountains, maneuver to fight the enemy wherever they were, countermarch, all of which adds up to be substantially farther than the straight line distance. So 2,000 miles from Cunaxa to Katyura might still be an overstatement, but it's true that it would have been substantially farther than 400 miles. There's a good reason the scribe decided to insert that little update about marching distances here, too. Because the Greeks' luck was about to turn and they were about to finally get some ships and not have to march anymore for a bit. But like seemingly all gifts on this campaign, this one would come with its own complications. The first complication was the city of Katyura itself. Unlike Trapezus and Chrysois, Katyura was initially not receptive to the friendship of the army. They didn't provide a market, and they didn't allow sick and wounded soldiers inside the walls for treatment. So the Greeks set up camp and started plundering the surrounding barbarian tribes for food as per usual. After some time of this, ambassadors arrived by sea from the city of Sinope, led by a guy named Hekatonamos. Sinope was another Greek colony quite a bit further west down the Black Sea coast, specifically a colony of Miletus, which was one of those Ionian Greek cities on the west coast of Asia Minor, and Trapezus, Chrysois, and Katyura were in turn all colonies of Sinope. Hekatonamos and the rest of this delegation from Sinope were there to find out why the Greeks were laying waste to the territory surrounding Katyura. They were initially angry at the Greeks, but the Greeks explained that they were acting out of necessity for their own sustenance. Trapezus and Chrysois had both provided them with a market to buy their food, and in return they had only plundered the tribes that were enemies of those cities and left their friends and allies alone. In fact, in their entire trip from Cunaxa to the Black Sea, the Greeks had been perfectly willing to buy food rather than just taking it from whatever peoples they encountered, even the barbarians. Many times they had made friendly overtures to different peoples only to be rebuffed and end up having to fight them, probably the most notable one being the Kardikoi. So they were perfectly willing to buy their food as much as they could, with whatever scant coin they had, and refrain from plundering people, even barbarians. But at the end of the day, the army had to eat, and if they couldn't buy their food, they didn't have much of a choice except to take it by force. So Xenophon explained all this to Hekatonamos and the Sinopians, saying that this was basically their situation now. The Greeks did have some coin on hand now from the sale of captives at Trapezus and Chrysois, so they would be able to buy their food, but Katyura had not seen fit to provide them with a market like the other two cities, and so they were left with the option of pillaging the surrounding barbarians. The Sinopians saw the reason in this, ordered the Katyurites to make friends with the Greeks, and from that time on they provided them with a market. Hekatonamos also strongly advised the Greeks to continue their journey home by sea instead of continuing the march along the coast, and said the Sinopians would provide ships to them for this purpose. Some of the Greeks were initially suspicious that he was suggesting this for selfish reasons, either his own or his city's, but regardless, they had been eager to take the journey by sea back at Trapezus after all, so they decided to take him up on his offer, on the condition that they obtain enough ships to transport the whole army and not leave any of them behind to continue on foot. This was an important provision because the army recognized that its strength lay in its unity. If they allowed themselves to be divided, even temporarily, their strength would diminish by a lot and they would lose a lot of bargaining power in whatever negotiations might come up between here and home. So Hecatonymos set off back to Sinope to make the arrangements for the army's transport, along with a delegation of officers from the army. And this is where Xenophon maybe got himself into a little bit of trouble with the army. He writes, quote, "Meanwhile, as Xenophon contemplated the many hoplites that the Greeks had, and also their many peltasts, archers, and slingers, and horsemen too, by now all really quite competent from the practice they had had, and as he noted that they were on the Black Sea, where so large a force could not have been put together without considerable expense, it seemed to him that it would be a fine thing to add both territory and strength to Greece by their founding a city. And he thought it would become a great city when he took into account both their numbers and the people who lived in the neighborhood of the Black Sea. So before he spoke to any of the soldiers about it, he summoned Silanos, the Ambraciot who had been Cyrus' seer, and set about offering sacrifice to inquire about these matters. Silanos, fearing that the idea might be put into effect and that the army would settle down somewhere, told the troops a tale of how Xenophon wanted the army to settle down so he could found a city and obtain power and a great name for himself. Personally, Silanos wanted to reach Greece as soon as possible. When the soldiers heard what Silanos was saying, some of them thought that it was best to remain there, but the majority did not. Timasion the Dardanian and Thorax the Boeotian told some merchants from Heraclea and Sinope who were present that unless they provided pay for the army, so that they had food supplies when they sailed away, there would be a considerable danger that such a great force would stay in the region of the Black Sea. For in the discussions that Xenophon is holding with us officers, he is encouraging us to choose the moment when the merchant ships arrive to say to the army all of a sudden, 'Men, at present we see that you are without the means to obtain food supplies on the voyage, or, once you have departed homeward, to be of any advantage to your people at home. But if you want to take your pick of the inhabited lands around the Black Sea and capture wherever you fancy, and then go back home or stay here, just as each of you wishes, here are ships at your disposal with which you can make a sudden attack wherever you may want.'" End quote. So Xenophon starts to think, maybe we don't actually go all the way back to Ionia. He's figured out what we've been talking about for some time now, which is that this army was a powerful political force on the Black Sea coast, and they could probably carve out a solid living for themselves if they chose to do so. And remember, ancient armies were generally not made up of just soldiers either. They also had that large contingent of camp followers that went with them and contained craftsmen, slaves, merchants, and, of course, women. What they had was the beginnings of a city. In a lot of ways, they were already kind of like a traveling city, and had been since breaking from Tissaphernes. So Xenophon does what any pious Greek would do and consults the seer to see if this idea is any good. But the seer pulls what seems to me like a pretty serious breach of etiquette at the very least, and starts blabbing to his friends about this because he doesn't want to stay here. He wants to go home. And you probably can't really blame him for that, or for that matter, any of the other soldiers that also decided they still wanted to go home. These guys had been through hell for the last year, and now that there was finally light at the end of the tunnel for getting to see their homes again, who would want to just stop now? But this whole thing kind of blows up in Xenophon's face, with the whole army hearing about it and then talking to the merchant sailors about it too, all because this seer Silanos ran his mouth when he probably should have kept that in confidence, at least until the proper sacrifices were complete and Xenophon was able to find out what the will of the gods was on the matter. Now, I'll acknowledge right now that we only get to hear about this story from Xenophon himself, so obviously it's his side of the story. I'm sure there's another side to it, but we don't get to hear it because Xenophon is the only one of these guys we have any writing from, so I can only go off of what he tells me. But he tells us that the two guys he mentioned in that quote before, Timasion and Thorax, spoke to the assembled soldiers, strongly urged them not to stay here but to leave, and offered them different proposals for exactly where to go and what to do next. A couple other officers spoke up about how Xenophon was wrong for trying to decide these things in private without consulting the soldiers, and then Xenophon spoke up in his own defense. And he tells us that he said this, quote, "Men, I offer sacrifices, as you see, regarding as many subjects as I can, both on your behalf and on my own, in order that in speech and thought and deed I may succeed in working whatever is going to be best and most honorable for you and for me. and recently I have been offering sacrifice about this very issue, whether it would be better to start to speak to you on this subject and set it in motion, or not to touch the matter at all. Silanos the seer gave me the answer to the most important question by saying that the sacred signs were favorable, for he knew that I am not ignorant on these matters because I am always present at the sacred rites. He said that some trick or plot against me was evident in the sacred signs, as well he might, knowing that he himself was plotting to malign me to you. For he was the one who produced the story that I intended to put my ideas into action without having first persuaded you. For my part, if I saw that you were without resources, I would have looked into how we might manage things so that once you had captured a city, those who wanted to could sail off right away, while those not of that mind could leave once they had gained enough to be of some assistance to their people at home. But since I see that the Heracleans and Xenopians are sending you the merchant ships so that you can sail away, and that men are promising pay to you from the next new moon, it seems to me a fine thing for us not only to get safely to where we want to be, but also to be paid for achieving our own salvation. So I am giving up my former plan myself, and as for anybody who approached me saying that it was necessary to put it into action, I say they too should give it up now. For I know this: if you continue all together in great numbers, as you are now, I think you would both be held in respect and have food supplies, for it is given to those who are already strong and powerful also to take the possessions of the weaker. But if you were dispersed and your forces divided into small groups, you would not be able to obtain sustenance, nor would you enjoy an easy escape. So I think, as you do, that we should travel away from here to Greece, and that if anyone stays here or is discovered deserting before the whole army has reached safety, he should be condemned as a wrongdoer. Whoever agrees with this, let him raise his hand." End quote. And then he says that every one of them raised their hands. This whole speech is really Xenophon reasserting his authority over this army, and it wasn't the last time he would have to do this. Almost immediately it happened again. I'm not going to go into all the details of this drama, but to sum it up, Silanos, Timazion, and Thorax were kind of out of the good graces of the army for the moment because the Heraclean and Xenopian merchants decided to withdraw the promises of pay for the army they'd made when these guys were coming up with their own plans independent of Xenophon. So they came up with a new plan of trying to persuade the army to go sail to the city of Phasis in Colchis on the east coast of the Black Sea as a way of getting paid. Notice that it would have been backtracking to do this. To get to Phasis, they'd have to sail east out of Katyura, while to get back to Greece, they'd have to sail west. But Timazion and Thorax did this sort of in secret, going to the officers first with the idea instead of taking it directly to the assembly of the soldiers, and the rumor somehow got out that Xenophon was actually planning to sail the army to Phasis in secret. And so Xenophon made another speech to the assembled soldiers, basically calling them a bunch of idiots for believing that, basically telling them, "You guys all know that to get to Greece we have to sail west. Don't you think you'd notice if we hopped on the ships and I led you east instead? You all know where the sun rises and sets. It's not like you wouldn't be able to figure it out. And when you did inevitably figure it out, I'll be on one ship and you'll be on 100, so it's not like you'll have a hard time stopping me. I'm not trying to deceive you, and I wouldn't be able to even if I wanted to." Once he'd finished that speech, Xenophon pointed out something else that he saw as more serious, which was the problem of indiscipline developing in the army. I'm going to read this speech in full because it's indicative of this idea we've been talking about with how the army started to have internal problems when the pressure of enemy territory was taken off. He said to the soldiers, quote, "You are aware, I suppose, that there were strongholds in the mountains occupied by barbarians who were friendly to the Carasuntians, and people would come down from them and sell us animals for sacrifice and other things they had, and some of you too, I think, used to go to the closest of these places, buy something in the market there, and come back again. When Clearados the captain learned about this place, that it was small and also that no guard was set there as the inhabitants thought they were on friendly terms with us, he went there in the night to pillage it, without saying anything to us. He intended, if he took this stronghold, not to return to the army again, but to embark on a merchant ship in which his messmates would just then be sailing off the coast, and having loaded it with whatever he had seized, to sail away, out of the Black Sea. This plan had been agreed between him and the messmates on the merchant ship, as I am now aware. So he called together all those he had persuaded and led them to the place. But while he was on his way, day broke. The people gathered together and threw missiles from secure positions, and Clearados was struck and killed, together with many of the others, though some few of the Greeks managed to return to Charasois. All this occurred on the day on which we were setting out for here on foot, and some of those who were going to sail along the coast were still in Charasois, not yet having put to sea. After this, the Carasuntians tell me, men from the stronghold arrived, 3 of the elders, seeking admittance to our assembly. Since they failed to catch us, they went on to say to the Carasuntians that they were at a loss to understand why we had decided to attack them. However, or so the Carasuntians later reported, when they themselves explained that the affair had not been undertaken as a result of a deception by the army as a whole, the 3 elders were pleased, and they intended to sail here with the aim of informing us of what had happened, and, as regards the dead bodies, to tell those so minded to take them and bury them. But some of the Greeks who had escaped from the failed attack happened to be still in Charasois, and when they learned where the barbarians were going, they brazenly pelted them with stones, and started to encourage the others to do the same. The men, the 3 ambassadors, actually died as a result of being stoned. Since this had happened, the Carasuntians came to us and recounted the affair, and when we generals heard it, we were horrified at what had happened, and we entered into discussions with the Carasuntians as to how the Greek corpses might be buried. We were holding our meeting outside the armed camp when suddenly we heard a great hubbub of, get them, stone them, stone them. And shortly afterward, as one might expect, we saw many people running up with stones in their hands, and others picking stones up. The Carasuntians were afraid, as well they might be, since they would also have witnessed the affair in their own city, so they retreated to the ships. And by Zeus, there were even some of us generals who were afraid. Nevertheless, I went toward the mob and asked what was the matter. There were some of them who knew nothing about it, even though they were holding stones in their hands. When I did fall in with someone who knew, he told me that the market superintendents were treating the army appallingly. At this point, someone saw the market superintendent, Xenophon, slipping off toward the sea and raised a cry. When they heard this, they charged after him as if they had a wild boar or deer in their sights. But the Carasuntians, when they saw the troops rushing toward them, evidently thought it was they who were the target of the charge, and they ran away in flight and ended up in the sea. Even some of us ended up in the sea alongside them, and those who did not know how to swim drowned. Now, what do you think about these people? They had done no wrong, but they feared some madness might have fallen on us, like rabid dogs. So if things like these are going to happen, stand back and see what will be the state of our army. All of you collectively will not have the authority either to start a war against whomever you may wish or to put an end to it, but any individual who wishes to do so will lead an army against whatever target he wants. If any ambassadors were to come to you in search of peace or of anything else, those who so wish will kill them, and so make sure that you do not hear what they were coming to say to you. Furthermore, whatever leaders all of you as a body may elect will have no standing at all, but whoever elects himself general and takes it into his head to shout, stone him, will thereby obtain the power to kill an officer, or for that matter any ordinary person from among you whom he may want to put to death without trial, if there are those who will obey him, as happened in the recent instances. Consider what these self-elected generals have achieved for you. In the case of Xenophon, the market superintendent, if he has been doing you wrong, he has left by sea without giving you recompense. If he has done no wrong, he has fled from the army, fearing that he would be put to death unjustly and without trial. In the case of those who stoned the ambassadors to death, their first achievement is that you are the only Greeks in the world for whom it is safe to go to Charasois only when strong in numbers and weaponry, and their second achievement is that it is not safe for you, even if you bear a herald's staff, to take up the corpses of your comrades, which earlier the very people who slew them were telling you to bury. For who will want to act as a herald when he himself has killed heralds? Instead, we ask the Carasuntians to bury them. If these are honorable outcomes, then pass a decree to that effect. By voting in favor of such occurrences, you will be deliberately encouraging individuals to create their own private guards and to try to take up quarters only where they have control of the higher ground commanding the site. However, if you think that such deeds are characteristic of wild beasts rather than of human beings, look into some way of putting a stop to them. Otherwise, in the name of Zeus, how shall we perform sacrifices to the gods with glad hearts when we are carrying out impious deeds? Or fight our enemies, seeing that we are slaughtering each other? What friendly city will take us in if they see us display such utter lawlessness? Who will dare to provide a market for us if we show ourselves guilty of such offenses as regards the most serious matters? And where we thought we would obtain praise from everyone, who would praise us if this is the sort of people we are? Indeed, I know we ourselves would say that those who commit such acts are scum." End quote. Well, this turned out to be convincing. Trials were held to punish those responsible for these and other acts of indiscipline, and the army was ritually purified through sacrifice to the gods. Xenophon himself was accused and put on trial for, of all things, a couple instances of alleged overly heavy-handed discipline of his men during the march to Trapezus. He defended himself successfully and was acquitted. Around late August or early September of 400 BC, the army finally boarded merchant ships provided by the Sinopians and Heracleans and set sail to the west, continuing their journey home. Their next stop was Sinope, a little further down the coast, and no sooner did they arrive there than who of all people showed up to meet them but Chrysophos. As a reminder, he was a Spartan and the first among the 5 generals elected after the deaths of the original commanders, and we last saw him sailing away from Trapezus on his own to go see his buddy Anaxibios, the Nauarchos, and try to procure ships for the army's transport. Well, not only had the army made their way a significant distance along the coast without ships in his absence, but they'd also procured ships of their own by now. And the icing on the cake was that rather than returning with a fleet like he'd set out to do, Chrysophos came back with only one single trireme. It turned out his buddy Anaxibios wasn't too keen on the idea of providing them with ships, but he did give Chrysophos and the army a nice metaphorical pat on the back for achieving what they had in making it to the Black Sea from Cunaxa, and said that if they came and saw him at Byzantium, he'd have some pay for them. This will become important very soon. Now that Chrysophos was back and they had ships, the army could almost taste their return to Greece. But then, Xenophon tells us, quote, "As they seemed to be getting near to Greece, the question of how they might arrive home with something in hand now began to press on them even more than it had previously." End quote. That's right, they still really didn't have anything to show for this whole expedition beyond a good story, but once again, they were mercenaries, and mercenaries don't get paid in stories. So with a view towards securing some wealth for themselves before they got home, the soldiers took it in mind to choose a single general as their overall commander, instead of the council of 5 generals they'd rolled with for all the expeditions so far. They figured a single commander would be more able to make decisions quickly when needed, maintain secrecy when needed, and generally better able to execute some scheme that might net them some wealth. And the first man they asked to take the command was Xenophon. Now, one might think Xenophon would jump at the chance to be the one in charge and not have to discuss decisions in council with the other generals before executing them, but he was actually quite a bit more circumspect about this because taking this command would be a bit of a high-risk, high-reward thing to do. This army had already accomplished something incredible, and their fame was sure to spread far and wide once word of their exploits made it back to Greece. And in fact, we know word definitely had already made it at least as far as Byzantium at the mouth of the Black Sea since Chrysophos had been there, and with all the merchant shipping constantly running back and forth along the coast in and out of the Black Sea to both Greece proper and Ionia, it was a fair bet that word had already spread quite a lot further than Byzantium. So any man involved with this expedition would have some honor and glory attached to his name just by virtue of being a part of it, and Xenophon was no different. Xenophon had a chance here to add even more glory to his name by taking sole command of the army and leading them the rest of the way home, with a little detour to collect some coin. You know, if a lower officer or a joint commander could gain glory from this, how much more so could a sole commander gain? On the other hand, Xenophon says, quote, "Whenever he reflected that for every human being it is unclear what the future will bring, and that for this reason there would be a danger of throwing away even the reputation he had already achieved, he was unclear which way to go." End quote. As seemingly close as they were to home, there was still plenty of opportunity for some disaster to befall the army, especially if they got involved in another war somewhere for the chance at bringing home some money. And if that were to happen with Xenophon in supreme command, well, then his reputation would suffer accordingly. And he doesn't mention this at all here, but I have to think that the fiasco of the Drelai expedition loomed large in his mind as he considered this decision. So like any pious Greek would do, Xenophon consulted the gods by offering sacrifice to Zeus, and in an uncharacteristically clear answer for these kinds of oracular responses, he tells us that Zeus gave him a definitive no. Don't do it. Don't accept the command. He actually says the answer from the gods was so clear that even a layman could see what it meant, a layman meaning one not trained in the art of reading sacrificial signs. Xenophon spoke to the assembled army and at first didn't tell them about the sacrifices. He said he was honored that they'd chosen him for the command, but for a variety of reasons that I won't go into here, he was going to have to turn it down. The soldiers didn't want to take no for an answer at first. They pressed him on it and said they really would rather have him than anybody else, and in the end he was forced to reveal to them the fact that he'd already consulted the gods about this and they'd told him no, so his answer was final. That reason the soldiers were willing to accept, and so they went with their second choice for Supreme Commander, Chrysophos. Chrysophos took charge, and the army boarded their ships again and set sail for their next destination of Heraclea, another one of those Greek colonies on the southern Black Sea coast, this time a colony of Megara. 2 days later they were there, camped outside the city, and at Heraclea is where the army really started threatening to fall apart. It seems there was a sizable portion of the men who'd gotten pretty dissatisfied by now with the fact that they hadn't been getting paid, a large enough portion that an Achaean named Lycon was able to stir them up to anger at their generals for not getting pay for them from somewhere. And to remedy this, Lycon, along with a couple other ringleaders, persuaded them that the thing to do was to go demand money from the Heracleans, in an amount which would have been considered a fortune. As ambassadors to go deliver this message to the Heracleans, they first chose Chrysophos and Xenophon, both of whom said, "No, this is a terrible idea. We're not going to go demanding money from a friendly Greek city." So instead, Lycon himself went, along with a couple of his buddies, and reportedly made threats against the Heracleans if they failed to deliver the coin the army wanted. The Heracleans, predictably, politely told Lycon they'd consider it amongst themselves, and then promptly shut themselves up inside their city and prepared to repel an assault. Well, this was an insane, reckless demand. It was insane and reckless because the army had no ability whatsoever to back up their threats. I mean, as powerful as they were no match for the walls of Heraclea. This was a fortified city with strong walls, and while the Heracleans might not have been able to raise an army that could match the 10,000 in the field, they had nothing to fear as long as they stayed inside their walls. The 10,000 probably wouldn't have been able to mount a successful assault on such walls even on their best day, but as fractured and disordered as they were at the moment, that was even more of a pipe dream. They weren't really equipped to conduct a siege either, and even if they had been, it wouldn't have worked. Heraclea had a powerful navy and direct access to the sea for resupply, so they couldn't have been starved out. I've mentioned a couple times how this army was by far the largest and most powerful on the Black Sea coast at this time, but I think everybody kind of understands that making empty threats is a great way to make yourself look weak as hell, regardless of how strong you might actually be. So the discipline problem the Greeks had by this point was seriously threatening to undermine and squander any political advantage their military strength might bring them. And what's more is that the army seems to have well understood that Lycon's threats were empty, because once the Heracleans shut the gates, they just kind of accepted that their bluff had been called and didn't make any attempt to extract money by force. Instead, Lycon and his buddies blamed Chrysophos and Xenophon for the failure of their extortion scheme, and decided to break up the army and take the Arcadians and Achaeans off on their own. Xenophon writes, quote, "Their arguments were that it was disgraceful that Peloponnesians and Lacedaemonians should be under the command of an Athenian who was making no contribution to the army's forces, and that they had the hard work while others had the profits, even though it was they who had achieved the army's deliverance. For, they said, it was Arcadians and Achaeans who got things done, while the rest of the army amounted to nothing. And indeed, as a matter of fact, the Arcadians and Achaeans totaled more than half of the army. So if they were prudent, they would band together and choose generals of their own, and then make the journey by themselves and try to get hold of something good on the way. That was the decision, and having deserted Chrysophos, to the extent that there were any Arcadians and Achaeans with him, and also Xenophon, they did band together, and they chose 10 generals of their own, who they voted should act upon whatever the majority of them decided. So Chrysophos' overall command was dissolved then and there on the 6th or 7th day from when he was elected." End quote. It seems that Xenophon's decision to listen to the gods and not accept the overall command was looking pretty good right about now. So this little quote harkens back to what I said all the way back in part 1 of this series, how this was a pan-Hellenic army made up of contingents from all over the Greek world, but mainly from the Peloponnesian or Spartan side of the Peloponnesian War that had just ended a few years ago. Arcadia and Achaea were both regions in the Peloponnese, more or less allied with Sparta and opposed to Athens in the late war, although, as with everything in that war, it's a lot more complicated than that. And, of course, the Athenian they're talking about there is Xenophon. And while Xenophon had declined the official overall command of the army, he would undoubtedly still have been a prominent unofficial leader given everything they'd been through. By the way, when they say he'd made no contribution to the army's forces, what they mean is that he hadn't brought any troops along with him from his home city, which is true. There was no significant Athenian contingent in this army. So the Achaeans and Arcadians, led by this Lycon, who made up more than half the total force, decided, screw this Athenian guy, and for that matter, screw Chrysophos too. You might expect them to have a little more respect for Chrysophos, given that he was a Spartan, but after all, Chrysophos had ruined their extortion of the Heracleans as far as they were concerned, and besides, the Achaeans and Arcadians made up most of the army anyway, so screw the Spartans too. And then Xenophon writes, quote, Xenophon, however, wanted to make the journey in company with Chrysophos, thinking that this would be safer than for each to set out on his own. But Neon was arguing the case for making their way in separate contingents. He had heard from Chrysophos that Cleandros, the Harmost in Byzantium, was saying that he would come to Calpe harbor with triremes. So this was the reason for his advice, in order that only he and Chrysophos and their soldiers should sail away on the triremes, and no one else should participate. Chrysophos, partly through depression at what had happened and partly because of his consequent hatred for the army, allowed Neon to do whatever he wanted. For a time, Xenophon made an attempt to sail away and leave the army behind, but when he offered a sacrifice to Heracles the leader, consulting him on whether it would be better and more fitting to soldier on with the troops who had remained or to leave them, the god indicated through the sacred signs that he should soldier on with them. And thus the army came to be in 3 parts. One of Arcadians and Achaeans, more than 4,500 of them, all hoplites, another with Chrysophos, 1,400 hoplites and 600 peltasts, Clearchos Thracians, and a third with Xenophon, 1,700 hoplites and 300 peltasts. But only Xenophon had cavalry, about 40 horsemen. The Arcadians, who managed to extract merchant ships from the Heracleans, were first to sail, with the idea of making a sudden attack on the Bithynians and seizing as much as possible. They disembarked at Calpe harbor, more or less in the middle of Bithynian Thrace. Chrysophos, on the other hand, started out from the city of Heraclea, and from the outset made his way by land through the countryside. But once he had advanced into Thrace, he went along the coast, as on top of everything else he was ill. Third, Xenophon obtained merchant ships, disembarked on the boundary between Thrace and the land of the Heracleans, and made his way through the interior. End quote. So the army was in full-blown meltdown mode now. Internal divisions and discipline issues had torn it apart at the seams once there was no longer the relentless pressure of enemies on every side. And they were about to reap the consequences of such a reckless thing as splitting the army up, even in relatively friendly territory compared to what they'd been through before. To orient you a little bit here, we are in Bithynian Thrace, and Xenophon talks about Thracians in this part. You typically think of Thrace as being on the west side of the Bosphorus in Europe, but this is a distinct region called Bithynian Thrace, still east of the Bosphorus on the southern coast of the Black Sea and Asia Minor, that was inhabited by Thracian peoples. And Calpe harbor, where the Arcadians and Achaeans landed, was about 60 or 70 miles east of the Bosphorus, so we're getting pretty close to Byzantium at this point. So anyway, the Achaeans and Arcadians, with over half the army, arrived at Calpe harbor first, given that they had sailed the whole way, while Xenophon's group only sailed part of the way, and Chrysophos marched overland the whole way. And as soon as the Achaeans and Arcadians got there, they immediately got sloppy. They further split up their force into companies and dispersed over the countryside to raid the Thracian villages for food, taking many prisoners in the process. But it didn't take long for escaping Thracians to spread the word about what was happening and gather themselves together into a force large enough to start attacking these isolated Greek companies. They finally did start making attacks, and Xenophon says they were able to completely wipe out 2 Greek companies almost to the last man. Now, he never really says what the size of a company was in this army, but if you assume they were roughly comparable in size to a modern infantry company, they could be anywhere from maybe 100 to 200 men. So with 2 companies wiped out, that's at least a couple hundred men right there, which was a significant loss for this dwindling army. The remaining Greek companies were able to regroup at a previously agreed-upon rendezvous point on top of a hill in the area, where they were immediately surrounded by the victorious Thracians, who were growing in numbers all the time as more and more men streamed in from the surrounding villages. And the Greeks were kind of back to having to fend off the same kinds of attacks they'd faced back when they first broke with Tissaphernes. The Thracians would either run up on foot or ride up on horseback and pelt them with arrows, sling stones, and javelins, and then run away again. The Greeks had already learned how to deal with these tactics with light infantry and ranged weapons, but as Xenophon said in that quote from a minute ago, this Achaean-Arcadian force was made up entirely of hoplites, which is to say heavy infantry, which is to say they had poor mobility compared to the Thracian light troops and cavalry, and no ranged capability to speak of. They were right back to square one, this time with a much smaller force than the Greeks had started out with back in Persia. They had to stay up on top of this hill because if they tried to move, they'd just be picked off on the march by Thracian archers and javelin throwers. But they also couldn't retaliate against the Thracians right now because they had no way to hit them back at long range, and the hoplites were too slow to run any of the enemy down before they could retreat to safety. So the Greeks were left with no choice but to sit up on top of this hill and take it while the Thracians pelted them with impunity. And by the way, they didn't have any access to water up there. While on the march, nearing Calpe harbor, Xenophon's contingent started coming across Thracian civilians and asking if they'd seen any other Greeks in the area, trying to find out information about the Achaeans and Arcadians, and thereby found out the predicament they were in, cornered and surrounded on a hilltop. And despite the current bad blood between them and the Achaean-Arcadian contingent, Xenophon's group was quick to understand the implications of their situation. Xenophon reports this speech that he gave to his soldiers then. Quote, "Soldiers, some of the Arcadians have died, and the rest are under siege on a hilltop. It is my personal opinion that if they are wiped out, there is no safety for us either, since the enemy are so many and are now in such good heart. So the best thing for us is to go as quickly as possible to help the men, so that if they are still alive, we can have them alongside us in the fight and not be left by ourselves, alone in our danger. Yes, let us by all means make camp presently, provided we continue to advance right up to the time that seems best for our evening meal. And while we are making our way onward, Tamasion is to ride ahead with the cavalry, though still keeping us in his sight, and is to scout out what lies in front of us, so that nothing escapes our notice. There is no real alternative to advancing against the enemy, for there is nowhere we could manage to run away to from here. It is a long way to go back again to Heraclea, and a long way to get through to Chrysopolis, and the enemy are close by. The shortest route is to Calpe harbor, where we suppose that Chrysophos is, if he has survived. But of course in that place there are no merchant ships in which we can sail away, and if we stay there, our supplies are insufficient for even one day. It will be a bad business if the Arcadians under siege are wiped out and we go through the danger alongside just Chrysophos' troops. Better then if the Arcadians are saved and we all go to the same place together and achieve safety by our collective efforts. Come on then, we must be on our way, having made up our minds either to die gloriously or to accomplish a most noble deed by saving so many Greeks. Perhaps it is the god who is bringing this about, in his wish to humble those who boasted of their superior wisdom and to give us the position of greater honor, since we make the gods our starting point. However that may be, you must keep up and pay attention to carrying out your instructions." End quote. So Xenophon led his contingent with all possible speed toward the hilltop where the other Greeks were besieged, guided by the Thracian prisoners who had told them about their situation. Xenophon's contingent was much smaller than the Achaeans and Arcadians, but unlike them, he had peltasts, ranged troops like archers and slingers, and even some cavalry with him, so he'd be better able to deal with the Thracian light troops. And as he approached, Xenophon ordered that his men burn everything they possibly could along the route as they went. The idea seems to have been to raise as much smoke as possible to make the Thracians think they were a much larger force than they actually were, and it seems to have worked because when they got to the hilltop where the siege was happening, the Thracians had already fled. It turned out that once the Thracians fled, the Achaeans and Arcadians on the hilltop saw that they were no longer surrounded and took off back to Calpe harbor, hoping to reunite with the other segments of the Greek army. It seems that at least they learned their lesson about what a bad idea it was to split the army up. They did successfully reunite with Xenophon's contingent at Calpe harbor and Chrysophos' contingent shortly after that, although it turned out that Chrysophos had died of illness during the march from Heraclea. Xenophon writes, quote, "On the next day all the soldiers assembled. It was especially Agasias, the Stymphalian captain, who took the lead, together with another of the captains, Hieronymus of Elis, and others who were the oldest of the Arcadians. They passed a decree that if in the future anyone made mention of dividing the army in two, he should be punished with death, that they should return to the way the army had been organized previously, and that the previous generals should be in charge. By this time, Chrysophos had died as a result of medicine that he drank while in a fever, and Neon of Asine took over his contingent." End quote. Kind of an anticlimactic end for one of the men who led the Greeks ever since the deaths of the original generals, but I guess that's how it goes sometimes. Well, besides the near disaster of the Achaeans and Arcadians on the hilltop, another effect of this fiasco of splitting the army up was that the merchant fleet that had transported them from Katiora to Sinope to Heraclea, and finally part of them to Calpe harbor, had moved on. The sailors had their own business to attend to, and they couldn't afford to sit around waiting for the Greeks to resolve their internal squabbles, which meant that the Greeks were once again stuck without ships. And Calpe harbor was not a place with a large city nearby, just a lot of strong, hostile Thracian villages that might take it in mind to make another move to attack them, which meant they'd need to move on as soon as possible. The problem with that was that the omens were not good. Something you have to understand about ancient armies, and especially about ancient Greek armies, is that they tended to take the gods very seriously. These were not materialistic people. They truly believed in spiritual entities and forces that played an active role in human affairs. I've mentioned sacrifices and omens a few times in this series, and there was a whole art to these things. Armies, including this one, would employ seers who were trained in the arts of divination, whose job it was to make the blood sacrifices and read the omens in the entrails, through which it was believed that the gods would communicate their intent to the mortals. It was routine to offer such sacrifices before any major undertaking or decision, such as setting out on a journey, going into battle, or in this case, setting out on a new leg of a journey. And again, generals took these things very seriously. There are recorded times when an army will be all lined up for battle and ready to attack an enemy, but the sacrifices come back saying they shouldn't attack, and they would call off the attack, maybe try the sacrifices again the next day. In this case, Xenophon and the rest of the generals knew they needed to move on from Calpe harbor, but wouldn't you know it, the sacrifices came back against it. Xenophon writes, quote, "But when they offered the sacrifice to inquire about their departure, appropriate sacred signs were not forthcoming, so they broke off for that day." End quote. On a maybe important note, the seer performing these sacrifices was not the same one that had ratted Xenophon out to the men about that whole founding a city idea back in Katiora. Xenophon tells us that guy had deserted on one of the merchant ships and was no longer with the army, so this was a different seer. Well, the army started to get suspicious that maybe Xenophon was manipulating these sacrifices because he wanted to stay here and found a city, so the next day Xenophon invited anyone who wanted to come see the sacrifices themselves to come, including any other seers who might be with the army, to prove that he wasn't doing any funny business. But the next day, and the day after that, the omens still came back negative. By this time, the army was just about out of food, so Xenophon decided that if the sacrifices weren't good for leaving the area, he'd offer sacrifices to check on sending out detachments to forage instead. But those too came back negative. Xenophon was adamant that the omens had to be respected, even if it meant going hungry, and he refused to lead the men out of camp as long as the omens were bad, but not everybody in the army was so pious. Neon, the general who had replaced Chrysophos after his death, found a local guide who told him where some raidable villages were nearby and decided it was time to let the men go out and round up some food for themselves. About 2,000 of them left the camp in search of food. Now I say it that way, 2,000 of them left the camp, instead of saying Neon led them out, because, at least from the way Xenophon tells it, it doesn't seem like Neon really did any leading at all. He just had a herald go through the camp and announce that there was a local guide who knew where some villages were, and that they could go out and raid them if they wanted to. What happened next should have been fairly predictable to just about anyone involved, and it's the kind of thing that, if you were Xenophon, you might attribute to the gods punishing the Greeks for ignoring the omens. But you could just as easily chalk it up to the fact that there seems to have been next to nothing in the way of organization or planning for this little excursion. The men were scattered, disorganized, and probably half-starved from the last little while of not having anything to eat. And who else appeared than a large force of, not Thracians, but Persian cavalry? We haven't really seen any Persians in a while, but this seems as good a time as any to remind you that the Greeks had never left the Persian Empire. The king's effective power over his territory might have been weaker out here on the Black Sea coast, but this was still very much a part of the empire. It was in the satrapy of Hellespontine Phrygia. The satrap there was a guy named Parabasis, who was still very much hostile to these Greeks. He'd apparently gotten word of their recent fighting with the local Thracians, and he took advantage of this opportunity to deal them a blow. 500 of the scattered and half-starved Greeks were killed by Parabasis and his horsemen, while the rest scattered even further and fled to the hills. When Xenophon heard of this back in camp, he first offered sacrifice to inquire of the gods whether he should go out and rescue the men escaped from the slaughter. This time the omens came back in the affirmative, and he took a detachment out and successfully rescued the 1,500 or so men hiding in the hills and brought them back to camp. They spent a tense night in camp at Calpe Harbor, wondering if they were about to be attacked again, but they weren't, except for some light skirmishing with Thracians at a couple of outposts. First thing in the morning, they dug a ditch all the way across the approaches to the camp as a defense against any further attack. Maybe it was that, or maybe it was something else that got them back into the gods' good graces, but either way, their fortune finally started to turn. That morning, a merchant ship from Heraclea pulled into Calpe Harbor, and the men were finally able to get something to eat. They were also able to replenish their stock of sacrificial animals and give the omens another try. And this time they came back positive for going out on raiding expeditions again. The first thing they did was to bury the men who'd been killed by Parabasis' horsemen the day before. Once that was complete, they took to foraging for more food. While that was going on, Parabasis appeared again, this time with not only his cavalry, but also with a large force of Thracian foot soldiers. But fortunately for the Greeks, it appears this foraging expedition was quite a bit more well-organized than the last one, or maybe more favored by the gods, and they were able to get themselves formed up into a cohesive unit, rout the enemy, and drive them off. After that, the Greeks pretty much had free rein to plunder whatever villages they wanted to in the area, so their supply problem was solved for the moment. Now, I sort of mentioned in passing a guy named Cleandros a little while ago. He was a Spartan and the Harmost of Byzantium, a Harmost being maybe sort of like a military governor. Remember, the Peloponnesian War had left Sparta in control of a lot of cities, one of which was Byzantium. Xenophon had mentioned before he left Heraclea that he'd heard Cleandros might come to Calpe Harbor with enough ships to transport the army wherever they needed to go. So the play for the moment, now that they had food, was to sit tight and see if Cleandros would show up. Xenophon doesn't really explain this, but it seems odd to me that anybody would expect Cleandros to be able to do this for them, given that Chrysophos had actually been to Byzantium and spoken to Anaxibios, another Spartan official who was also based there, who'd been either unwilling or unable to provide them with ships. Cleandros did arrive at Calpe Harbor, but when he did, sure enough, it was only with 2 triremes and no merchant ships, which wasn't much good to the army. He did take a liking to the Greeks, though. This was despite some less than flattering rumors he'd heard about them at Byzantium, and despite a less than ideal first impression they made on him when he pulled into the harbor. I won't go into the details on that, but you can read Xenophon's book if you want the whole story. In the end, he was impressed enough with them that he actually wanted to take command of them himself and lead them to his city. But once again, the gods said no to this through the sacrifices. He respected that. The army stuck with its current leadership, and Cleandros told them he would receive them warmly when they got to Byzantium. After 6 more days of marching down the coast, they arrived at Chrysopolis, just across the Bosphorus from Byzantium. It was now, according to my edition, about late October of 400 BC, and the Greeks were more or less on the cusp of being back in Greek territory. They'd been in the neighborhood of all these Greek colonial cities, but that was kind of different. Now they were on the shores of the Bosphorus, which, along with the Propontis and the Hellespont, formed the historic boundary between Europe and Asia. So looking at a map, you have the Black Sea, and the Bosphorus is the outlet that comes out of the southwestern end into the modern-day Sea of Marmara, what the ancients would have called the Propontis. Then there's another strait coming out the southwestern end of that, the Hellespont, that empties into the Aegean Sea and finally the Mediterranean. So Byzantium sat on the European side of the Bosphorus, and Chrysopolis sat right across from it on the Asian side. Pharnabazos, the satrap, as far as I can tell, had never had any involvement with this Greek army prior to now. He was never involved with Tissaphernes in putting down Cyrus' rebellion, and he'd never been involved in the pursuit of the Greeks after Cunaxa. Even so, he was clearly acting with hostility toward the Greeks now. He clearly hadn't wanted them in his territory, but now that they were on the brink of crossing into Europe, he seems to have just wanted them gone more than anything else, before they caused any more trouble for him. So he sent to Anaxibios, the Spartan Nauarchos at Byzantium, and offered him pretty much anything he wanted if he'd just get the army to cross the strait and get out of Asia. Anaxibios duly invited the army across, offered ships to transport them, and told the generals there'd be pay for them when they got to Byzantium. It also seems that at this point, Xenophon had just about had enough of this shit, and who can blame him, right? I mean, the army was proving almost impossible to manage when they didn't have a concrete goal in front of them, and since they were about to be back in Europe now, Xenophon must have figured, you know what, I've done my job getting these guys back to Europe safely. They can figure it out from here. I'm out. He told Anaxibios he wanted to just sail away on some merchant ship from Chrysopolis, but he says Anaxibios ordered him to cross the strait with the army and come see him in Byzantium first, and then he could leave if he wanted to. So Xenophon reluctantly agreed. While they were waiting to cross the strait, Xenophon got another visitor, a Thracian named Medocides. Now, Medocides himself isn't particularly important to this story, except as he relates to the guy who sent him, a Thracian prince by the name of Seuthes. Now, we talked about Thracians a little bit when the army went through Bithynian Thrace. Well, on the other side of Byzantium was Thrace proper, kind of in the area of modern-day southeastern Bulgaria, far northeastern Greece, and far northwestern Turkey. But this prince, Seuthes, had somehow heard the Greek mercenaries were coming this way, probably through the Spartans at Byzantium, and he smelled opportunity. Through his messenger Medocides, he told Xenophon that if he could get the army to cross the Bosphorus, he'd make it worth his while. Xenophon responded to that by saying, "Look, bro, we're already planning on crossing the strait with or without your bribes. As soon as we do, I'll be out of here and you can propose to the other generals whatever you see fit. It's none of my concern." And he crossed the strait with the rest of the army. Seuthes the Thracian will become important very soon. But before the army could think about him, they'd have to deal with yet another crisis that threatened to tear them apart. Because not only did they have to deal with their own indiscipline, now they also had to deal with shifty politicians trying to play games and manipulate them for their own ends. Because remember, internal issues aside, their very strength made them a serious political force in this region, whether they wanted to be or not. So Anaxibios offered them pay to induce them to cross the strait, but when they got there, surprise, surprise, he didn't pay them. Xenophon doesn't really say whether he actually couldn't pay them or just didn't want to, but either way, he didn't. Maybe he just thought he was going to earn something from Pharnabazos by getting the Greeks out of Asia without having to really give up anything of his own, and he thought he could finagle the situation to get them out of his hair once they were over. But he had a problem. The Greeks were already in his city because the harbor where the ships dropped them off opened directly into the city. So he couldn't very well just tell them he wasn't going to pay them because despite their recent losses, they still numbered somewhere around 8,000 men, and nobody wants 8,000 pissed-off, battle-hardened combat veterans running amok in their city streets just taking whatever they want. So he had a herald announce to the troops that they were to pack up their gear and march out the front gate of the city. He stationed a man at the gate to take a head count so he could be sure all of the Greeks really were out, and once they were, he could bar the gate and tell them to be on their way. The soldiers were predictably not very happy about this because they had no money to buy food anywhere they went, so they were already keyed up. Then at some point, while they were still filing out through the gate, with most of them out and only a few still left inside the city, they overheard Anaxibios having a little side conversation with some of the captains and generals. He told them they could loot Thracian villages for food as they went, and they could go down to the Chersonese, to another Spartan named Kiniskos, who would give them pay, instead of being paid by Anaxibios like they were told. The Chersonese is the long, narrow peninsula on the European side of the Hellespont, by the way. Well, then Xenophon tells us about the army's reaction to this. Quote, "Some of the soldiers, on overhearing this, or perhaps it was one of the captains, spread the news through the army. Meantime, the generals started to inquire about Seuthes and whether he was hostile or friendly, also whether it would be necessary to make their way via the Sacred Mount or by going around through the middle of Thrace. But while these people were still holding their discussion, the soldiers snatched up their weapons and ran headlong for the gates, intending to get inside the city wall again. When Anaxibios' lieutenant Eteonikos and those with him saw the hoplites running toward them, they shut the gates and put the bar in place. The soldiers began to hammer on the gates, saying that they were being treated very unfairly and being cast out to the enemy, and they declared that they would break down the gates if those inside would not open them willingly. Others started to run down to the sea, and they climbed over into the city along the breakwater running out from the wall. Some of the soldiers happened to still be inside, and on seeing what was going on by the gates, they cut through the crossbar with axes and threw the gates open, and in burst the troops. When Xenophon saw what was going on, he was afraid that the army would turn to looting, and irreparable harm would be done to the city, to himself, and to the soldiers, so he started to run, charging in through the gates together with the mob. As for the Byzantines, when they saw the army bursting in by force, they fled from the marketplace, some to the merchant ships, some to their homes. Those who happened to be indoors ran outside, yet others set about launching the triremes, supposing that in the ships they might be safe, and all of them thought that they had been ruined, believing that the city had been captured. Eteonikos fled straight to the high ground, while Anaxibios ran down to the sea and sailed around to the Acropolis in a fishing boat. He then immediately sent for guards from Chalcedon, as the troops he had on the Acropolis did not seem sufficient to contain the rioting men. When the soldiers saw Xenophon, they crowded around him in large numbers and said, "Now you can become a big man, Xenophon. You have a city, you have triremes, you have money, and you have all these men. Now, if you wanted, you would help us, and we would make you great." He replied, in an effort to calm them down, "Sure, what you say is a good idea, and I will do it. But if this is what you really want, then fall in and ground your arms as quickly as possible." Not only did he give these instructions personally, he also kept telling the others to pass on the word to ground arms. The soldiers fell in by themselves, and in a short time the hoplites were drawn up 8 deep, and the peltasts had run across to either wing. The place where they were, called the Thracian ground, is the finest possible location for holding a review, level and clear of houses. When they had laid down their weapons and been calmed down, Xenophon called the army together and spoke as follows. Quoting speech Xenophon now. "Brave soldiers, I am not surprised that you are angry and that you think you are being treated dreadfully and being subjected to this deceit. But if we were to gratify our wrath and punish the Lacedaemonians here present for their deception, and if we sack the city, which is not at all to blame, bear in mind what will be the result. We shall be the proclaimed enemies of the Lacedaemonians and their allies, and from our memories of what we saw happen very recently, we can well imagine what sort of war might arise in consequence. We Athenians went to war against the Lacedaemonians and their allies with no fewer than 300 triremes, if one includes both those at sea and those in the docks. A great deal of money was kept on the Acropolis, and state revenue used to come in from home and abroad to the tune of no less than 1,000 talents a year. We ruled over every one of the islands, and we held many cities in Asia and many others in Europe, and indeed this city of Byzantium itself, where we now are. And with all these advantages, we were ground down to exhaustion by the war, as you are all aware. So then, what do you think would happen to us now, when the Lacedaemonians not only have their old allies on their side, but the Athenians and those who were formerly Athenian allies are all with them too? When, furthermore, Tissaphernes and all the other barbarians on the coast are all enemies of ours, and inland is the most hostile to us of all, the great king himself, whom we set out to deprive of power and even to put to death if we could. With all these acting together, is anyone so senseless as to think that we would prevail? Let us not, please God, go raving mad and perish shamefully as enemies of our native lands and even of our own friends and kinsmen, who all live in cities that will campaign against us. And they will be right to do so if, despite the fact that there was no barbarian city we wanted to occupy, though we had it in our power several times to do so, we nevertheless sack the first Greek city that we reach. So I, for my part, pray that I am 10,000 fathoms under the earth before I live to see such events brought about by you. And my advice to you is that since you are Greeks, you try to obtain justice by remaining obedient to the established leaders of the Greeks. Should you be unable to achieve that, we must still ensure that, wronged though we may be, we are at least not deprived of access to Greece. And now it seems to me that we should send word to Anaxagoras and say, "We have not entered the city to do anything violent, but to see if we can obtain any favor from you people. And if we cannot, then to make clear that we leave not because we have been tricked, but out of obedience." End quote. So Xenophon was successful in talking the men down and getting them back outside the city peacefully, and averted the total disaster that would have been the sack of Byzantium. I mean, find me a better example of one man's foresight winning out over the passions of a mob. I'm not sure you can. I don't think it's coincidental that Xenophon tells us in his narrative about a couple times before this when he'd considered the idea of just settling somewhere with the army instead of going all the way back to Greece. Because in a way, that's exactly what he's tempted with here in this little episode. The soldiers say, "Hey, look, we can pretty much have this city in our hands if we want it." And they would have been right for the immediate future. But like Xenophon rightly pointed out in his speech, there would have been no future in that. It would have been one thing to settle somewhere and found a city from an unsettled area. It would be a completely different thing to try to take a city from someone who already lived there, Greeks no less, that was run by the Spartans, who had at least some kind of working relationship with the Persian satrap in the area. The Bosphorus was one of the most important trade and communication arteries for all of the ancient world, and nobody was going to let the city controlling it be left in the hands of a rogue army of mixed Greek mercenaries. It would only be a matter of time before somebody got an army together big enough to take them down, and Xenophon, and ultimately the rest of the army, had the presence of mind to realize this and change course. So the army sent a delegation to go find Anaxagoras and tell him they'd be leaving the city. Now, before we continue, there's a little anecdote here that's not particularly important, but is pretty funny, and Xenophon seems to almost put this in here as an afterthought, but I'm very glad he did. While the delegation was still in their meeting with Anaxagoras, Xenophon writes, quote, "Koirotatus of Thebes appeared." End quote. Who is this Koirotatus? I have no idea, except that he was a Theban, apparently. This is the first mention of him in this book. The landmark edition of this has a short one-paragraph biography of him in one of the appendices, but it appears that not very much is known about this guy at all. But I won't say anything more about him. I'll just read the next sentence Xenophon writes. Quote, "Though he was not an exile, he was going around Greece seized with a desire for military office and proffering his services if either a city or a tribe was in need of a general." End quote. So you heard that right. This guy Koirotatus was apparently a traveling general, wandering around looking for an army to command. I mean, this sounds like something out of a damn Monty Python sketch, right? But apparently it was not unheard of in this world for men of means to look for opportunities like this. There's a footnote here in the landmark edition that says, quote, "If one wanted to be a general, the normal thing to do was to stand for election in one's native city. Hawking oneself around was, Xenophon suggests, appropriate only if one was an exile, and so could not serve one's countrymen." End quote. So why was Koirotatus running around as a traveling military consultant? Well, again, I have no idea because Xenophon doesn't say anything about why he was doing it. From the little bit that is known about him that's listed in the little one-paragraph biography, you can gather that he'd had some association with the Spartans during the Peloponnesian War. He'd apparently been trusted with the defense of Byzantium towards the end of the war in 408, but lost it to the Athenians. The Spartans took it back eventually, but the point is, Koivratadas didn't exactly have that great of a track record as a general. And he would go on to have more association with the Spartans in some drama back at his home city of Thebes in 395. And so David Thomas, the author of this appendix that has the short biography in it, kind of speculates that maybe Anaxagoras put him up to this as a way of getting the army out of the city. You know, he could take command, promise to lead them to their fortune, and then they'd be out of Anaxagoras' hair. But Xenophon doesn't say any of that here, so it's really just speculation. But what isn't speculation is that Koivratadas promised the army that he would lead them to great exploits in Thrace, and he would also provide them with as much food as they could want while they were at it. So the soldiers said, sure, why not? And they followed him out of the city. They made camp a short distance outside Byzantium, and Koivratadas arrived the next day, making this big, ostentatious show of bringing in food and drink for the army. Xenophon says he had 45 men with him carrying food and wine, but he didn't actually distribute any of it to the army yet. He made sacrifices on that first day, but the omens were not favorable. So then, on the second day, he prepared to offer sacrifice again, but before he did, 3 of the generals came up to him and said, "Look, buddy, where's the food and drink you promised us? Because you're not going to lead us anywhere unless you deliver on that first." So Koivratadas distributed the supplies he had, but it turned out to be nowhere near enough for the army even for a single day. And so Xenophon writes, quote, "He took the sacrificial animals back again and went away, renouncing his appointment as general." End quote. And that's the last we hear about Koivratadas in this book. Again, this whole thing is a Monty Python sketch. Xenophon himself, meanwhile, arranged with Anaxagoras to get passage aboard a ship back to Athens. He'd just about had enough of this shit and was ready to go, and he did. He writes of the army, quote, "Neon the Asinian, Phryniskos the Achaean, Cleonor the Orchomenian, Philesius the Achaean, Xanthocles the Achaean, and Timazion the Dardanian remained in charge of the army, and they had advanced toward various Thracian villages in the vicinity of Byzantium and were camped out there. At this point, the generals were divided into factions. Cleonor and Phryniskos wished to lead the army to Seuthes, as, in an effort to persuade them, he had given one a horse and the other a woman, while Neon wanted to take them to the Chersonese, thinking that if the army came under the control of the Lacedaemonians, he would be put in overall charge of it. Timazion, for his part, was eager to cross back over to Asia, thinking that he might thus return home, and this was what the soldiers wanted too. But as time wore on, many of them gave up, some selling their weapons around the countryside and then sailing away as best they could, others handing them over and merging into the cities. Anaxagoras was pleased when he heard that the army was disintegrating, for he thought that he would best please Pharnabazos if this continued." End quote. By all accounts, the existence of the 10,000 as a unit was about to end right here, finally. And it would have been maybe a kind of anticlimactic end, but not necessarily a shameful one. I mean, granted all the complications and internal strife during the march along the Black Sea coast, the army had succeeded in the end in getting back to Greek country, if not exactly Greece proper. And they were in an area now where it was relatively safe for individual soldiers to just kind of leave the army and either settle somewhere nearby or catch ships back to their home cities. It wasn't the return many of these guys would have hoped for. You know, we've heard repeatedly that these guys would have wanted to return home with something to show for their expedition that they could use to help improve their home cities, especially the more aristocratic officer types would have hoped for this. But given the circumstances of the whole thing, it wouldn't be too hard to argue that they ought to be counting their lucky stars just to have survived the trip at all. And Xenophon doesn't give a specific count for how many, but it's true that probably for a large minority of this army, this was the end of the journey. But the army didn't disintegrate completely, and the unit known to history as the 10,000, which started with close to 13,000 men and now had probably less than half that number remaining at this point, survived and maintained its core unit identity due to a weird coincidence of circumstance and personalities of a couple of powerful men. It just so happened that right around early November of 400 BC was turnover time for two important public offices in Byzantium, the Harmost and the Naorkos. We've talked about both of these before. Cleandros was the Harmost, sort of like a military governor, and Anaxibios was the Naorkos, the chief admiral of the naval forces based in the city. Successors to both of these offices were about to arrive from Sparta. Aristarchos would succeed Cleandros, and Polos would take over from Anaxibios. You don't have to know either of those names yet, by the way. This is the first mention of both of these guys in the story. I know it can be hard to remember these Greek names sometimes. Anaxibios sailed away from Byzantium together with Xenophon on the same ship. They touched land at Cyzicus on the southern coast of the Propontis, where they met Aristarchos, Cleandros' successor, headed the other way back towards Byzantium. He told them that Polos wasn't far behind. The next time they touched land was at Parium, further toward the western end of the Propontis, right on the cusp of the Hellespont leading back out into the Aegean. At Parium, Anaxibios contacted Pharnabazos, the Persian satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia. Remember, the reason he had induced the 10,000 to cross over into Europe in the first place was because Pharnabazos had offered him a reward for getting them out of his territory. One might call it a bribe if you were inclined to be uncharitable, but, this is how things often get done in the political world. So Anaxibios was looking to collect on his reward, but Pharnabazos had already heard that the turnover was about to happen and that Anaxibios wasn't going to be the Naorkos anymore. Since Anaxibios was no longer in a position to either help or harm Pharnabazos and his territory, Pharnabazos snubbed him. He said, "I'm going to deal with the new guys in charge in Byzantium now. I'll make my arrangements with them. Sorry, Anaxibios, you can just move on." Well, of course, Anaxibios was not too happy about this. In fact, as I'll mention a little bit later, the Spartans did end up going to war with some Persian officials in Asia Minor just a short time after this, including Pharnabazos and also Tissaphernes, and it's sort of speculated that maybe Anaxibios had an important voice in the decision to do that because of how he was treated by Pharnabazos here. But that was down the road a bit. Of more immediate importance was how this pertains to the 10,000. Conveniently enough, Anaxibios had an army of Greek mercenaries, or at least a significant core of it, still camped out in the neighborhood of Byzantium, and he happened to have Xenophon, one of the principal leaders of said army, sailing along with him on board the same ship. So he ordered Xenophon to go back to the army, hold it together as best he could to stop the disintegration that was in progress, and then take the army back across to the Asian side of the Propontis to be a menace to Pharnabazos again. He figured, well, if Pharnabazos is going to renege on his end of the bargain, I'll undo my decision to get this army out of his hair. Time was very much of the essence, since more men were drifting away from the army by the day. Xenophon writes, quote, "Anaxibios now called Xenophon over to him and ordered him to use every available ploy to sail to the army as quick as could be, to keep it together and to gather in as many of its dispersed elements as he possibly could, and then to lead it to Perinthus, and cross over to Asia as fast as possible. He provided him with a 30-oared ship, and sent a man with a letter to order the Perinthians to send Xenophon on to the army double quick, using relays of horses. So Xenophon sailed across and arrived where the army was quartered. The soldiers received him with joy and began following him right away, glad that they would be crossing over from Thrace to Asia." End quote. Like I said before, Xenophon doesn't give any exact figures for how much of the army he was able to hold together, but one of the appendices in this edition makes an argument for somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 men left. So in all likelihood, less than half the original 13,000. But this mission for Anaxibios to Asia would never take place. As soon as Xenophon was back with the army and it stopped disintegrating, all the power players in the region were instantly aware of it, and they descended like freaking vultures on him and the army, all trying to either court or coerce the army into serving their own ends. Even as depleted as the army was, everybody still knew what a powerful force they were in this region, and now that they had a leader again who could actually direct them towards a goal, they would be either a massive asset or a massive liability to everyone, depending on who they ended up serving. For starters, Aristarchos, the new Spartan Harmost at Byzantium, now had a vested interest in not pissing off Pharnabazos, because he was one of the guys who'd be receiving that bribe. So while the army was at Perinthus trying to embark for the trip back to Asia Minor, Aristarchos showed up, told all the ship owners in the area that they weren't allowed to take this army across, and ordered Xenophon to stand down. Xenophon told him he was acting under orders from Anaxagoras, and Aristarchus responded, quote, "That's all very well, but Anaxagoras is no longer Nauarchos, and I am the Harmost in these parts. If I catch any of you at sea, I will sink you." End quote. At the same time, the Thracian Medosides showed up again, still acting as a messenger from Prince Seuthes, trying to get Xenophon to bring the army to support the campaign he wanted to undertake. At first, Xenophon politely told him to get lost, but then something happened that made him reconsider. Aristarchus shut himself up inside the walls of Perinthus with the army camped outside, and the next day sent a messenger to Xenophon and a few other captains and generals, summoning them to come into the city and meet with him. But some sympathetic person in the city also sent a message to Xenophon warning him that Aristarchus was plotting against him and planned to either do something to him himself or hand him over to Pharnabazos. And I have to imagine that having heard that, and having been summoned with some other officers to a meeting with a guy of dubious friendliness towards him, Xenophon was probably thinking, "I've seen this movie before. No way am I going to that meeting." So he was immediately suspicious of Aristarchus and his intentions, but now he had to figure out what to actually do with the army if they couldn't cross over to Asia again according to the orders of Anaxagoras. Aristarchus and therefore Byzantium seemed hostile. He didn't want to go to the Chersonese because he didn't like the idea of submitting the army to the command of the local Harmost there, and he figured the food supplies wouldn't be very good. That left Seuthes, the Thracian prince, who twice now had contacted Xenophon with offers of friendship. And, well, they were still mercenaries after all, so why not go sell their services to this Seuthes? Of course, Xenophon still had no idea what Seuthes actually wanted to use the army for. So he set off in secret by night to go meet him in person, and it turned out Seuthes was camped with his army only 7 miles away. He said, "You wanted me? Here I am," and then asked Seuthes what he wanted to use the army for. Seuthes responded, quote, "Mycides was my father, and his domain consisted of the Melanditai, the Thynoi, and the Tranipsai. So it was from the country hereabouts that my father was expelled when the affairs of the Odrizai were ailing, and he himself died of a disease, while I was brought up as an orphan at the court of Medocos, who is now the king. Once I became a youth, I could not bear to live with my eyes fixed on someone else's table. I took to sitting on the same bench as Medocos, and entreating him as a suppliant to give me however many men he could in order for me to revenge myself, to the extent that I was able to, on those who had thrown us out. That way I would not have to live with my eyes fixed on his table like a dog. As a result, he gave me the men and the horses that you will see when day has dawned. And now, with them at my disposal, I live by plundering my own ancestral lands. But if you were to join me, I think that with the aid of the gods I should easily recover my domain. That is what I ask of you." End quote. In return, Seuthes promised good pay for the army, a share of any spoils they might take, ongoing protection for any of them who might need to shelter from the Spartans depending on what their reaction to this whole thing was, and for Xenophon in particular, his daughter's hand in marriage. Then Xenophon went back to his own army and presented them with the choice they were now faced with. He said, quote, "Men, Aristarchus here with his triremes is blocking us from sailing across where we want to, so that it is not safe to embark on merchant ships. This same person orders us to force our way to the Chersonese via the Sacred Mount. If we get control of the mountain and reach the Chersonese, he says that he will no longer act deceptively, but that instead you shall receive pay, and he will no longer overlook the shortage of food supplies, as he does now. That's what Aristarchus is saying. On the other side, Seuthes says that if you go over to him, he will treat you well. So consider whether you prefer to remain here and reach a resolution on this now, or do so only after going back for food supplies. To my mind, since we have no money to buy supplies in the market, and those around here will not let us take food supplies without money, the best course of action is to go back to the villages where the inhabitants are weaker and will let you take supplies from them. There, with food supplies in your possession, when you hear what anyone wants from you, you can choose whatever you think best. Whoever of you thinks this is a good idea, raise your hands." End quote. I mean, these guys were mercenaries after all, so it probably shouldn't be terribly surprising what they decided to do when presented with this choice. It was again time to go fight for gold and plunder in somebody else's war. They had a little trial run of having Soothes lead them to some vulnerable villages he knew of that they could raid for food supplies, and that seems to have gone well, so they took him up on his employment offer. They set out into the mountains of the Thinoi, one of the tribes Soothes had mentioned in his speech to Xenophon, kind of northeast, inland, away from the Propontis coast and back towards Byzantium. It was December now, getting on towards winter, and this mountain campaign became brutally cold. Xenophon says the Greeks found out real quick why the Thracians dressed the way they did, with their fox-skin caps and their heavy tunics and cloaks. Many of the Greeks suffered from frostbite, being less prepared for the cold than the Thracians were. But the campaign didn't slow down, and the Greeks also found out that Soothes was absolutely brutal towards the Thinoi. He went full scorched earth on what they called the Thynian Plain, below the heights toward Byzantium. Not only did he plunder villages, but he also burned them to the ground completely and left their people to either be taken as slaves or flee into the mountains in the dead of winter. This kind of thing was obviously not at all unheard of in the ancient world, but it does seem to me to be a little harsh to do to a people you ultimately want to be ruling over at the end of this campaign. But then again, I'm not an ancient Thracian warlord, so what do I know? The Thinoi did submit to Soothes by around the beginning of January 399, and immediately more problems arose over the army's pay. Soothes had a lieutenant named Heraclides, who he sent to sell off a bunch of loot from the raids and use the proceeds to pay the Greeks. But when he came back, there was only enough for about 20 days' worth of the agreed-upon rate, and they'd already been on campaign for about a month. Heraclides said that was all he was able to get for the sales. Xenophon called him out and said, if you really cared about serving Soothes, you would have found a way to raise the rest of the money instead of making excuses. Heraclides didn't like that and started talking shit about him to Soothes, and on top of that, the Greek soldiers blamed Xenophon for the fact that they weren't getting paid enough, and Soothes got annoyed because Xenophon kept hounding him about the pay. I mean, we kind of expect this stuff by now, but it is kind of funny to watch it all play out again. Next, they undertook another campaign against more Thracian tribes, crossing over the little peninsula there to the Black Sea coast and following it northwest for a while, subduing tribes the whole way. Xenophon says less about this part of the campaign, but it seems to have been fairly successful and lasted about through February. And when March came around, they were back on the Propontis coast at the city of Selymbria, and the army still hadn't been paid at all since that first time. Everybody was mad at everybody. The soldiers were mad at Xenophon, Soothes wasn't talking to Xenophon anymore, and the conditions were just right for some verbal fireworks when yet another political player showed up interested in hiring the services of the army. This player was another Spartan, a general named Thibron, who we have not met before in this story. Or rather, he didn't show up in person, but his two delegates, Carminos and Polynikos, also Spartans, showed up to act on his behalf. Sparta was now the hegemon of the Greek world now that Athens had been brought low by the Peloponnesian War, and that came with some responsibilities, such as providing for the common defense of the Greeks against barbarians. The Spartans had gotten complaints from some of those Greek cities in Ionia about Persian aggression. They needed protection, and Thibron was the man they sent to take care of it. Well, coincidentally enough, Ionia was the exact region the 10,000 had set out from with Cyrus all the way back at the beginning of the campaign, and the region they'd been trying to get back to since Cunaxa. And the Persian responsible for the aggression against the Ionian Greeks was none other than Tissaphernes. That's a name we should all remember very well. As it turned out, the great king Artaxerxes had been very happy with Tissaphernes' work putting down Cyrus' rebellion, and as a reward had made him satrap over all of Cyrus' former holdings, which brushed right up against these Ionian Greeks. How much of his aggression now had to do with the fact that these Greeks had provided troops for Cyrus' rebellion, I couldn't really tell you, but the point is the Spartans were going to war against Tissaphernes, and they wanted to hire the 10,000 to help them, or really more like 5,000 or 6,000 at this point, as we've said. So the Spartans in the region apparently wanted to be friendly towards them again, and you'd think the army would jump at the chance for getting paid to go fight the man who'd betrayed them and stranded them 1,000 miles deep in enemy territory just over a year ago. But remember, everybody was pissed off at everybody else right now, so it couldn't be that simple. Heraclides heard that the Spartan delegates had come for the Greek army, and he saw a golden opportunity to get rid of them, so he went straight to Seuthes. Seuthes put on a banquet for the delegates, saying he wanted to be friends with them, but he didn't invite Xenophon or any of the other generals to the banquet. And while there, he and Heraclides maligned Xenophon to the Spartans, saying he was the kind of officer who tried too hard to be friends with his subordinates instead of commanding them. They said he didn't have the respect of the men, which might have seemed sort of true at the moment at least, and that if they offered pay to the men, they'd follow them regardless of what Xenophon said. So the next day, the army assembled and the Spartan delegates presented their plan, saying, hey, you get to go punish your old enemy Tissaphernes and get paid to do it, and the soldiers were predictably pretty excited about the idea. And one unnamed Arcadian stood up in the assembly and seems to put voice to the general dissatisfaction the whole army was feeling towards Xenophon at the moment. He said, quote, "You know, Lacedaemonians, as far as we are concerned, we would have been in your service long ago if Xenophon had not used his persuasive powers to bring us away here, to this place with its dreadful winter, through all of which we have never ceased to campaign both by day and by night. He has the fruits of our labors. Seuthes has enriched him personally, but deprives us of our pay. So if I could see him stoned to death, paying the penalty for the way he has dragged us around, it seems to me that I would then have my pay and not be at all weighed down by the toils we have endured." End quote. And then again, Xenophon had to speak up in his own defense. Quote, "Well, human beings must expect anything and everything, so it seems. Otherwise, how could I now be getting the blame from you in this business where I think I can testify, at least to my own satisfaction, that I have shown the greatest zeal on your behalf? In the first place, I turned back when I had already set off for home, not under the impression, no, by Zeus, not at all, that you were doing well, but rather because I was hearing that you were in difficulties and I wanted to help you in any way I could. And then when I arrived, and Seuthes here was sending messenger after messenger to me and making me many promises if I persuaded you to go to him, I did not try to do any such thing, as you yourselves know. Instead, I led you to where I thought you would cross over to Asia the most quickly, since I believed that that was best for you, and I knew that it was what you wanted. But when Aristarchus came with his triremes and prevented us from sailing across, as a result I called you together, which was, of course, exactly the right thing to do, to discuss what action we should take. Well then, when you heard on the one hand that Aristarchus was commanding you to make your way to the Chersonese, and on the other that Seuthes was seeking to persuade you to campaign with him, you all spoke in favor of going with Seuthes, and you all voted for that. So in what way, then, did I do wrong in bringing you to where you had all decided to go? After that, Seuthes did indeed begin to tell lies about your pay. I do not praise him for that. If I were to do so, you would justly both blame me and hate me. But on the contrary, I was previously, above all others, his particular friend, and I am now, above all others, the one who is on the worst terms with him. How then, when I have chosen you rather than Seuthes, could I still justly get the blame from you on the very point on which I am on bad terms with him? But you may say that it is possible that I am being crafty and have taken for myself from Seuthes what is really yours. On that basis, this much is clear. If Seuthes was really paying me anything, of course his object in making the payment would not be to lose what he gave me and still have to settle up with you some other way. No, I suppose that if he had been making me any gifts, he would have given them with the aim of giving me a relatively small amount in order to avoid giving away a larger amount to you. If, then, you think that this is the situation, you can in an instant make the whole business completely pointless for us both by exacting payment from him. For it's clear that if I have had something from him, Seuthes will demand it back from me, and surely his demand will be a just one if I previously took a bribe and now I fail to carry through for him the business for which it was paid. But on the contrary, I think I am far from having what is yours, for I swear to you by every one of the gods and goddesses that the real truth is that I have nothing of what Seuthes promised me for my personal reward. He himself is present, and as he is listening, he can bear witness as to whether I am swearing false oaths. To increase your astonishment still more, I further swear that I have not received what the other generals have received, not even as much as some of the captains. And why, you may ask, did I act in this way? Because, men, I thought that the more I shared his previous poverty with him, the more of a friend he would be to me whenever he became powerful enough. Only now, when I see him flourishing, do I recognize all too clearly how his mind works. Someone might indeed ask, aren't you ashamed to be so stupidly deceived? Yes, by Zeus, I certainly would have been ashamed if I had been deceived by an enemy. But in the case of a friend, as here, it seems to me to be more disgraceful to deceive than to be deceived, since, if it really is right to talk in terms of being on guard against friends, I know that we took every precaution not to provide him with any just cause to avoid giving us what he promised. We did not wrong him in any way, we did not mismanage his affairs at all, and we certainly did not show cowardice in any enterprise to which he summoned us. But, you may say, you should have received the proper pledges, so that he could not have deceived you in any way if he wanted to. In reply to this argument, then, hear me say something that I would never have said in his presence if you had not seemed to be totally lacking in feeling, or at least in gratitude, toward me. Remember in what sort of difficulties you found yourselves, from which I extracted you when I brought you to Tissaphernes. If you approached the city of Perinthus, wasn't Aristarchus the Lacedaemonian refusing to let you in, having shut the gates? You were encamped outside in the open air, it was the middle of winter, and you were dependent on the market, though you saw that there were few enough things to buy and you had little enough money to buy them. Remaining in Thrace was unavoidable, since a blockade of triremes was stopping you from sailing across to Asia, and yet for anyone who remained there it was also inevitable that they would be in enemy country, in a place where there were many horsemen and many peltasts on the opposing side. We did have a hoplite force with which, if we had kept together as we attacked the villages, we might perhaps have been able to seize some small amount of food. But it would not have been possible for us to pursue and capture either people to enslave or herds of animals, for I found you no longer had an organized force of cavalry or peltast among you. So if, in this great necessity of yours, I had adopted Tissaphernes as an ally for you, even without having demanded any pay at all from him in addition, since he had what you needed, both cavalry and peltasts, would I really have seemed to you to have planned things badly on your behalf? For, of course, as a result of your joint action with these people, you found food in greater abundance in the villages, because the Thracians were all the more forced to flee in haste, and you have had a share in a greater number of animals and slaves. Also, when the cavalry was added to our number, we no longer saw any of the enemy, though previously they had been boldly following us close behind, and by means of their cavalry and peltasts, they had altogether prevented you from spreading out in small groups and so obtaining more abundant food supplies. If, then, by his assistance he has provided you with this degree of safety but has not added very much pay for achieving it, is this indeed the terrible tragedy as a result of which you think I should surely be put to death? And now, as things stand, how are you placed as you leave? Haven't you passed the winter with an abundance of food supplies, and with anything you received from Tissaphernes coming over and above that, as it is the enemy's property that you have been using up? Furthermore, in the course of your exploits, you neither had to endure the sight of the dead bodies of any men from your own ranks, nor did you lose any men through their being captured alive. If you have achieved something honorable against the barbarians in Asia, haven't you not only preserved that achievement, but also now added further glory to those deeds, since on top of what had happened before, you have overcome the Thracians in Europe against whom you campaigned? I say that though you are angry with me on account of all this, by rights you should feel gratitude to the gods for these benefits. Such is the state of your affairs. But now, in the name of the gods, come and consider how mine stand. When I was going home on that earlier occasion, I started on the return journey much praised by you, and through you with a glorious reputation in the eyes of the other Greeks. And I was trusted by the Lacedaemonians. Otherwise they would not have sent me back to you. But now I am going away maligned by you to the Lacedaemonians, and an object of hatred to Tissaphernes on your account, when I had been hoping that as I had done well for him with your assistance, I would be securing a place that could serve as a noble refuge not only for myself but also for my children, if I were to have any. And you, for whose sake I have in so many ways annoyed people much more powerful than myself, and on whose behalf I have even now not yet ceased to labor to do whatever good I can, you have such an opinion of me as this. Well then, you have me in your power here, and that isn't because you took me in open flight or caught me trying to steal away. If you do what you say, be aware that you will have put to death a man who spent many, many nights awake for your sake, who toiled alongside you and put himself in danger, both when it was his duty and also beyond it, who in addition, by the grace of the gods, set up with your assistance many trophies over the barbarians, and who contended against you in every way I could to prevent your making yourselves enemies to any of the Greeks. Indeed, as a result, it is now possible for you to make your way wherever you choose to go by land and by sea without blame from anyone. And now, when your situation appears entirely free from difficulties, and you are sailing to the very place where you have long wished to go, when those with the greatest power stand in need of you, pay is in prospect, and leaders who are reputed to be the best have come here, does now really seem to you to be the time to put me to such a death as soon as possible? It was certainly not like this when, during our time of difficulties, you used to call me Father, you people who have the most excellent memories, and promise to remember me forever as a benefactor. But these people here who have now come to fetch you are not stupid, so I don't think you are improving their opinion of you when you behave like this toward me." End quote. Well, remember that at the banquet the night before, Seuthes had told the Spartan delegates that Xenophon was the type to be too keen on being friends with the troops. But after hearing what went on in this assembly, they started to think the math ain't mathin' here. If he's so buddy-buddy with the troops, why is he so pissed at them, and why are they saying they want to kill him? And they started to figure out that Seuthes might be a bit of a bullshit artist. But in the end, Xenophon was able to win over the Spartan delegates and at least somewhat win over the soldiers again with this speech. The next thing the soldiers did was to ask the Spartans to try to help them extract their pay from Seuthes, and Seuthes made a hasty exit while the army prepared to move with the Spartans. Before they crossed back over into Asia, Xenophon was able to have one last conversation with Seuthes where he kind of approached him as a friend and laid out all of his issues. He basically told him, "Your reputation is going to suffer if you treat people this way. You approached me asking for my friendship, and I gave it to you. My men and I helped you win control over all the lands you wanted to rule, and in return you stiffed us on our pay, didn't give me any of the things you promised, and you tried to ruin my reputation with my own men. You say you want to be a ruler in Thrace, you can't treat your friends like this and expect people to support you. People are going to hear about this, and they're not going to want to be your friend." In the end, Seuthes said he would give what he could in the way of pay to the army. This turned out to be woefully less than he'd promised in the beginning, but at least it was something. Now, Xenophon was ready to go back home again. Seems like he'd been ready to go home for the last 6 months at least. But his closest friends in the army talked him into staying at least long enough to see them over to Asia. So they crossed over, landing at Lampsacus in the Troad. This is right on the Hellespont, actually not that far from the ancient city of Troy where the famous Trojan War took place. Xenophon lamented the fact that, like all the rest of the soldiers, he still had basically nothing material to show for this last year plus of campaigning. He says he was so broke at this point that he had to sell his favored horse at Lampsacus to even afford passage home aboard a ship. He also met a seer named Euclides there, a man he seems to have known from all the way back home in Athens, and after hearing about his predicament, Euclides told him that Zeus Malikios was impeding him, but that if he offered sacrifice to Zeus Malikios in the way that Euclides had done with his family back home, he might propitiate the god. By way of explanation for that, a footnote in the Landmark edition says here, quote, "Zeus Malikios, Zeus the Gentle, was an avatar of Zeus who appeared in the form of a serpent and was regarded as the bestower of riches. At about this time of year, late March, the Athenians sacrificed to him at the Diasia, a festival to propitiate the dead. Euclides' reference to the sacrifice he used to offer with Xenophon's family could well refer to this festival, when different Athenian localities made idiosyncratic offerings, according to Thucydides as now understood." End quote. The next day, Xenophon went to the city of Ophrinaon, a little further down the Hellespont coast to the southwest, offered sacrifice in the way Euclides had prescribed, and sure enough, his luck changed. 2 men, who he calls Biton and Naucleitus, showed up in the city, and Xenophon doesn't say anything at all about these men. He doesn't even tell us where they're from. He just drops their names like we're supposed to know who they are. But they showed up with money for the whole army. And as the cherry on top, they brought back Xenophon's favorite horse that he'd just sold at Lampsacus. They said they'd heard that he had to sell it. They'd also heard that he liked that horse a lot, so they brought it back and brought it to him as a gift. Maybe it was because of this turn of fortune, or maybe it was because of problems back home that we'll talk about shortly, but for the moment at least, Xenophon abandoned his plan to leave the army and sail home. They headed south across the Troad, on their way to meet Thibron, and ended up at the city of Pergamum in Mysia, which, as a point of reference, was just about 70-ish miles or so northwest of Sardis, where the army had originally set out from with Cyrus on his campaign. And I'm just going to read you this part because, as if we didn't have enough crazy-ass things happening in this story, we just had to get one more. Xenophon writes, quote, "There Xenophon was warmly received at the house of Hellas, the wife of Gongilos the Erythraean and mother of Gorgion and Gongilos. She pointed out that Ausidates, a Persian man, lived in the plain, and she said that if Xenophon went by night with 300 men, he would capture him, and not only him but his wife and children and store of wealth, and there was a lot of it. She sent her cousin and Daphnagoras, whom she was accustomed to rate very highly, to guide Xenophon there. So with these two alongside him, Xenophon set about offering a sacrifice, and Basius the Elean, who was there acting as seer, said that the sacred signs were very favorable toward him, and the man should be easy to capture. After Xenophon had dined, he set out on his way, taking with him the captains who were his closest associates, and those soldiers who had proved themselves reliable throughout in order to do them a good turn. About 600 other people forced themselves on him and tried to come too, but the captains drove them off, thinking it was easy money and not wanting to have to divide their own share. They arrived about midnight. The slaves who lived in the region of the tower ran away from them, as for the most part did the livestock that Ausidates owned, but they paid no attention to them in their effort to catch Ausidates himself and his family. When they proved unable to take the tower by direct assault, for it was high and large and was defended by battlements and many warlike men, they tried to tunnel through the ramparts. The mud brick wall was 8 bricks thick, but they completed the tunnel just as the day broke. As soon as the sunlight shone through it, someone from inside struck a blow with an ox spit right through the thigh of the nearest Greek, and thereafter they fired arrows out through the hole, ensuring that it was no longer safe to approach that way. What with their shouts and lighting of beacons, Idobulus with his own personal force came out to help them, as did Assyrian hoplites and Hyrcanian cavalry from Comania, about 80 of them, these being in the king's pay, and in addition about 800 peltasts, and also some troops from Parthenion and others, including cavalry from Apollonia and the nearby strongholds. Then, of course, it was time to consider how they were going to make their retreat. They seized as many cattle and sheep as were there and began to drive them off, and slaves as well, having first put them all inside a hollow rectangle. They did this not because they still had their minds on the booty, but in order to prevent the retreat turning into outright flight. That could have happened if they had left the booty there and made off, as this would have made the enemy bolder and disheartened the soldiers, but as it was, they were withdrawing as if they would make a fight of it for the sake of the booty. When Gongilos saw how few were the Greeks and how many those attacking them, he came out himself, despite his mother's objections, with his personal force, wishing to share in the good work, and Procles, the descendant of Damarados, also brought help from Halisarna and Teuthrania. By now Xenophon's troops were very hard pressed by the arrows and slingstones, and they were making their way forward in a circular formation, so that their shields might provide protection against the arrows. With difficulty they crossed the river Carcassos, about half of them wounded. There too Agasias the Stymphalian captain was wounded, all the time continuing to fight against the enemy. But they came through safely, with about 200 slaves and sheep enough for sacrificial victims. On the following day, Xenophon offered sacrifice, and then, during the night, he marched out with all the army in order to go as far into Lydia as possible. The idea was that the people would then be off their guard, instead of being afraid because they knew the Greeks were close. But Ausidates had heard that Xenophon had again offered a sacrifice to inquire about attacking him, and that he was coming with the whole army, and he moved out temporarily to some villages that lie below the township of Parthenion. Xenophon's troops fell in with him there by pure chance and captured him and his wife and children, his horses, and all his possessions, and thus the earlier sacred signs were fulfilled. Then they went back to Pergamum. There Xenophon saluted the god, since the Laconians and the captains and the other generals and the soldiers joined together in arranging for him to have his pick of the horses and teams of oxen and the rest of the booty, with the result that there was enough for him now to do someone else a good turn as well. End quote. So Xenophon finally turns around and just makes his fortune in a couple days, right at the end of the journey, by kidnapping this wealthy Persian living somewhere near Pergamum. And then he says, quote, "After this, Thibron made his appearance and took over the army, and having combined it with the rest of the Greek forces, he made war against Tissaphernes and Parabasis. End quote. And that's the end of the book. That is the last sentence, except for a couple later scribal insertions kind of summing up what peoples the army had marched through in their journey and how far they'd marched. It's a very abrupt ending. It's like, wait, we don't get to hear about this campaign with Thibron they're about to go on against Tissaphernes and Parabasis? No, we don't, unfortunately. It's abrupt, but it's actually not uncommon for these ancient stories to both begin and end this way. There's a term for this, in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. I'm actually not sure if it's proper to apply it to the end of a story. It's usually applied to the beginning, but it seems to fit here. There's actually a larger point to be made about this that I'll mention in a minute, but it can be a little bit jarring to end a story this way. We want to have everything wrapped up in a nice little bow, have all the loose ends tied up. So to give some semblance of that, I'll read a little bit of the epilogue that the Landmark edition gives. This is by Shane Brennan, one of the editors. He writes, quote, "With Cyrus and his rebellious force out of the way, the king consolidated his power and subsequently went on to enjoy a long reign, 405/4 to 359/8, the longest of any Achaemenid ruler. In spite of persistent difficulties with Egypt, which rose against him after his accession, Artaxerxes came to be the dominant figure in the eastern Mediterranean in the first half of the 4th century. The king's peace of 387/6 gave him unfettered control of the cities in western Anatolia, and with the subjection of the island of Cyprus shortly afterward, a century of Greek naval ascendancy on the seas was reined in. Artaxerxes had 3 sons by his wife, Statira, to whom he was said to be greatly devoted, and by one report 115 illegitimate ones by concubines. He lived into his 90s. The king's mother, Parabasis, an eager supporter of Cyrus' attempt on the throne, exacted vengeance on all believed to have had a hand in her favorite son's death. Acarian, who claimed he was the one who had killed Cyrus, was put on the rack for 10 days, had his eyes gouged out and molten brass poured into his ears until he died. Masabates, a eunuch of the king who had cut off the head and right hand of Cyrus, was flayed alive. Parabasis was influential, too, in the later decision taken by the king to eliminate Tissaphernes, who was assassinated while taking a bath in Colossae, his severed head delivered in a bag to the court. With his death, she had avenged herself on the one whom she must have regarded as being the major cause of Cyrus' failure to rise to the kingship. Showing a softer side, Parabasis provided provisions for Clearchus while he was in prison in Babylon following his capture by Tissaphernes, and after the Spartans' execution in 400, in a touch that recalled Cyrus' love of gardening, she had palm trees planted on the place of his burial. In later years, the Greek accounts report that she came to exert great influence on Artaxerxes. Around 5,300 of the original 13,000 or so mercenaries who marched up country with Cyrus remained at the conclusion of Xenophon's narrative in Thrace. As Xenophon's own situation at that point showed, he had to sell his horse to pay for his proposed return to Athens. In terms of financial gain, the expedition had been generally disappointing. In spite of all their efforts to secure wages and booty over the course of the journey, few seem to have had much to their name in the end. The offer of employment from Sparta to fight in Asia reported near to the end of Anabasis would thus have been attractive. The pay of a daric per month indeed was the same as they had originally accepted from Cyrus, and there was the added bonus that they would fight against Tissaphernes, their old enemy. Led by Xenophon, the group crossed back from Europe to Asia and joined Thibron and his forces in spring 399 for the campaign. The showdown with Tissaphernes did not come until 395, by which time the army was led by Spartan king Agesilaos himself. Marshalling his forces on the plain of Sardis, where most of the 10,000 had joined Cyrus 6 years before, Agesilaos inflicted a striking defeat on the Persians. The Syrians later returned to Greece with the king and fought on the Spartan side at the Battle of Coronea in 394. We do not hear of them again as a separate unit. As we know from his flash-forward in Anabasis, the Spartans settled Xenophon on an estate near Olympia in the Peloponnese. It is probable he remained there from the late 390s to 371, when he was forced to leave following the collapse of Sparta's power in the region. Diogenes, in his biography, reports that he made his way to Corinth and lived there, but some modern scholars think he returned to Athens, where the decree of exile against him which he mentions in Anabasis had by that time been withdrawn. Wherever he lived, it is apparent that he was writing until the mid-350s, which is thought by many to be when he died. His extraordinary literary output was to a notable degree shaped by his early life experiences, prominent among those his time with the 10,000 and his contact with the philosopher Socrates. Xenophon had 2 sons that we know of, one of whom, Grillos, was killed at the Battle of Mantinea in 362. End quote. Speaking of Socrates, there's a bit of a tragic note in this story too. First off, Xenophon didn't go back to Athens immediately after the conclusion of his narrative, and he might not have gone back for decades, or maybe ever. He doesn't say a word about this in his narrative here, but the political situation back home while this expedition was going on was chaotic to say the least. Athens was still suffering from the fallout of its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, and still felt a lot of enmity towards its conquerors. Meanwhile, Xenophon was out here campaigning with a bunch of Spartans, as well as other Greeks who had largely been on the Spartan side in the war. And what's more, their expedition had originally been funded by and undertaken on behalf of Cyrus, a Persian satrap who had also funded the Spartans in their war against Athens. So the Athenians probably weren't feeling all that friendly towards Xenophon by the time he got back from this journey, and they voted to exile him, according to one source I found, either in 399 because of his association with Socrates, or later in 394 because of his participation in the campaigns in Asia Minor with Thibron and the Spartan king Agesilaos. Xenophon had been a student of Socrates, just like Plato was, and seems to have admired him a lot. You can read another work of his, the Memorabilia, which is pretty much his memories of Socrates, and just feel his affection for the guy spilling off every page. And remember that little anecdote from the first episode of this series about how he asked Socrates advice on whether to go on this campaign or not, and how Socrates told him go ask the Delphic oracle, but Xenophon instead asked the oracle how he could undertake the journey most honorably. Well, that turned out to be the last time he ever saw Socrates, because Socrates was put on trial and executed by the Athenians in 399. While Xenophon was either in Thrace or somewhere in Asia Minor. You can read all about that trial and execution in many ancient sources, but most notably in Plato's dialogues Euthyphro, Apology, Crito, and Phaedo. Now, as I've been working on the last part of this series, I've had to ask myself a couple times, why am I actually telling this part of the story at all? Because like I said at the outset of this episode, this part of the story is kind of like trying to figure out what to do next after you've just finished some big undertaking. The narrative isn't nearly as straightforward as it was before Trapezus. There's a lot more moving parts, a lot of important characters that kind of pop in and out seemingly at random sometimes. And there were a lot of opportunities to get bogged down in the details to the point where I kind of had to ask myself, who actually cares about any of this or wants to hear about it? And I didn't actually settle on a satisfying answer to this question of why I am actually telling you this part of the story until pretty late in the process of putting this episode together. I came up with 3 reasons, in order from least to most satisfying, at least in my opinion. The first one is the one I already told you in the last episode. It's in the book. Xenophon put it in there, and if the guy who was there and experienced all of this firsthand thought it was worth putting in the story, who am I to contradict him? But that's a bit of a glib answer. After all, I didn't want this series to just be a summary of what's in the Anabasis. And besides that, there's lots of stuff in the book that I didn't say in this series. And maybe I do want to question what Xenophon chooses to put in his book after all. Why does he cut it off so abruptly? Why do we not get to hear about the campaign with Thibron and Agesilaos against Tissaphernes? To be fair, Xenophon does talk about that campaign in another work, the Hellenica, but that's more of a geopolitical and military overview of it rather than a story from the perspective of the 10,000 like the Anabasis is. I think he probably ended it here because it is sort of a natural endpoint in one sense, which is that it's the conclusion of the army's round trip to Cunaxa and back. They'd more or less made it back to the same location they started out from with Cyrus in 401. Whatever happened next would kind of be a new chapter in their history, and they'd also be operating as a unit of a larger army again, rather than as an autonomous force of their own. But still, this choice of Xenophon's about where to end the story kind of leads into my second reason for covering this final third or so of the book, which is that it helps show the blurriness of the borders around historical events, I dealt with this a little bit in my last series when it came to the question of when the American Civil War really started and ended. We put these neat dates on it of 1861 to 1865 for the sake of easy reference and categorization, but as you'll know if you listen to that series, there was fighting in Kansas long before that and fighting in Missouri long after that, which, when properly understood, is all really part of the continuity of the same conflict. And the issues it was fought over go way further back than that and also continue to plague us down to the current day. And it's the same here. There's no definitive end to the 10,000 as a unit. They kind of drift around and keep being mercenaries for a while until they kind of fade away into the background of history after the Battle of Coronea in 394. It seems Xenophon's purpose with this book was not to tell us the complete history of this unit, but was to give us this one little slice of their history that started and ended near Sardis in Western Asia Minor. And this leads into my third and most compelling reason to tell this part of the story in this series, which is that I think the Anabasis has something to say on a kind of meta level about history, and even about storytelling in general. History, properly understood, is a form of storytelling. And this question of where to start and where to end is a constant question for everybody who tells any story about history. There is no objectively correct place the story starts or ends. In a certain sense, any historical story both begins and ends in medias res, unless, of course, you want to start with "Let there be light" and end with the eschaton. The historian's choice for where to start and where to end will end up having a lot to do with what his purpose is in telling the story in the first place. If your purpose was to tell an exciting, epic story with a neat, satisfying ending, you'd probably end it at Trapezus. And in fact, to go off on a little tangent, the closest thing we've ever gotten to a movie adaptation of the Anabasis story is the 1979 film The Warriors, which this series is obviously named after. It's less an adaptation and more a reimagining of the story that transplants the setting to that of New York street gangs in the 1970s. It sort of is to the Anabasis what O Brother, Where Art Thou is to the Odyssey. I've seen it and thought it was just okay. I didn't think it was anything spectacular, but it has gathered a pretty significant cult following since it was released. But anyway, the movie follows a gang called the Warriors based on Coney Island, by the sea, who send some delegates to a peace summit called by some kind of kingpin named Cyrus, appropriately enough. The summit is at Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. The Warriors take the subway there from Coney Island, but the meeting goes sideways. Somebody assassinates Cyrus, the Warriors get blamed for it. Now every gang in the city is after them and they have to make it back to their home turf on Coney Island. And the point of saying this is that the movie ends when they get back to Coney Island, back to the sea, which, if you wanted to map it onto its Anabasis equivalent, would be the point when the Greeks reach Trapezus on the Black Sea. It just seems to make for a neater, less complicated story to wrap it up there. I think I even said in the last episode that if you ever did make a true gladiator-style sword and sandal epic of this story, you'd probably want to end it there. But the more I think about it, the more I appreciate the fact that Xenophon didn't end his book there, because the fact that it shows what happens after the big climax makes it more grounded in reality in a way. This goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this episode. Stories typically end with some kind of climax. The main character or characters either accomplish the goal they've been striving for or fail to accomplish it, depending on what kind of story it is. Then there's some tying up of loose ends, and then it's over. But that's not how real life works. You might have some of those climactic moments in your real life, some definitive endpoint where you've finally accomplished something you've been striving for. But what happens next? The story of your life doesn't just end there. Well, unless the climactic moment involves your death. But leaving that aside, what happens after every one of those climactic moments? They pass, and you have to decide what to do next, which can often be even harder, or at the very least more complicated, than accomplishing the big goal was. Xenophon shows all that in colorful detail by narrating what happens after Trapezus. Another aspect to this is how the story gets remembered throughout history since then. Because for as seemingly little known as it is in the popular imagination today, criminally so in my opinion, it sure did make the rounds in the ancient world. Starting about 65 years after Xenophon's expedition, another Greek would make a foray into Persia. Actually, certain Greeks of the time would probably have been offended over me calling this guy a Greek. He was a Macedonian, a people which existed on the fringes of the Greek world and might have been considered half barbarian by some of the more mainstream Greek cities of that time. And his foray into Persia wasn't really a foray, but a conquering invasion. Of course, I'm talking about Alexander the Great. Over 4 centuries after Alexander conquered Persia, in the 2nd century AD, another Greek known as Arrian wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns. The edition I have bears the title The Campaigns of Alexander, but Arrian's own name for this work was the Anabasis of Alexander. I probably should have said this earlier, but the title Anabasis of Xenophon's book means something like the march up country, or the march away from the sea, referring to the march with Cyrus to the Battle of Cunaxa. Arrian borrowed that title when he wrote his history of Alexander's campaigns. He borrowed more than that, too. He also emulated Xenophon's 7-book structure for his own work, and he explicitly referenced Xenophon when laying out his motivation for writing the book. He says, quote, "Though Alexander was fortunate in other respects, here there was a void, since his exploits were not published to mankind in a worthy manner, either in prose or in verse. Nor were his praises sung in lyric poetry, as were those of Hieron, Gilon, Theron, and many others who do not bear comparison with him. Consequently, Alexander's exploits are much less well known than the paltriest of ancient deeds. For the expedition of Cyrus 10,000 against King Artaxerxes, and the sufferings of Clearchus and the men captured with him, and the march to the coast of those same men under Xenophon's command are much better known, thanks to Xenophon, than Alexander's exploits. Yet Alexander did not serve under another man's command, nor did he merely defeat those who impeded his march to the coast as he fled from the great king. One can point to no other man, Greek or barbarian, who performed exploits so numerous and so momentous. It was this, I affirm, that spurred me on to write this history, and I have not considered myself unworthy to make Alexander's exploits known to mankind." End quote. So at the time Arrian was writing, there hadn't yet been an adequate history written of Alexander, or at least not in his opinion, but the fame of the 10,000 had been spread far and wide through Xenophon's account. Arrian also mentions that Alexander himself brought up the 10,000 to his men at least once during his campaigns. The Battle of Issus was the second major battle of Alexander's invasion, and would be his first personal encounter with the king at the time, Darius III, who was a great-nephew of Artaxerxes II. In his pre-battle speech to the men, Arrian says, quote, "Alexander is also said to have recalled Xenophon and the 10,000, whose force, he declared, was not to be compared with his own, either in numbers or in any other quality, having had no cavalry, neither Thessalian, Boeotian, Peloponnesian, Macedonian, nor Thracian, nor as many cavalry from other nations as Alexander had in his ranks, nor archers or slingers apart from a few Cretans and Rhodians whom Xenophon had deployed on the spur of the moment when his situation became desperate. Yet those 10,000 had routed the king with all his forces at Babylon itself, and had defeated all the tribes they encountered on their march to the Black Sea." End quote. Now, this is the only time Arrian explicitly mentions when Alexander brought up Xenophon, but it's easy to imagine him having done it a lot more throughout the 10 years he was campaigning in Persia. Alexander was well known to be greatly interested in the history and mythology of the Greek world. He was famously educated by Aristotle himself, and he was well acquainted with Xenophon's work. And notice what he emphasizes, at least according to Arrian's account there. He tells the men, look, the 10,000 who were far less numerous and less well-rounded as a fighting force than we are right now, routed the king's forces at Cunaxa and defeated all these tribes during their march out to the Black Sea. My point is, he's emphasizing the march to the Black Sea. He doesn't talk about everything that came after that. This typical focus on the most triumphant part of the story sort of serves the interests of a concept that I need to say a little bit about, called Pan-Hellenism. I've alluded to this a couple times when I talked about the 10,000 as a Pan-Hellenic force. Pan-Hellenic just means all Greek, or made up of Greeks from all over the Greek world as opposed to just a particular Greek city. You have to remember that Greece back then wasn't Greece as we know it today. It wasn't a single nation-state. It was rather more of an ethnicity. Greece as a place back then was just the places where the Greek people lived, and politically it was divided up into thousands of independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and all the rest. Up until the time of Xenophon's campaign, and for a couple generations after, there had never been any such thing as a unified Greece in the sense of its being a single nation under one political structure. That being said, the Greeks did maintain a concept of themselves as Greeks. There was always the distinction between Greek and barbarian. Barbarian in this sense meaning peoples who didn't speak the Greek language. The Greeks were unified in some sense by a common language, customs, religion, etc., and everybody else was a barbarian of one flavor or another. The Greek world had also had a century or more of recurrent conflict with the barbarian Persian Empire to the east, going at least as far back as the Ionian Revolt of the early 490s BC that helped provoke the two Persian invasions, under Darius I in 490 and Xerxes I in 480. Even in those invasions, there had been no unified Greece to repel them, but alliances of independent city-states. But as the decades wore on and the Persian Empire waned in power, some started to wonder what could possibly be accomplished if the Greek world were to unify under one ruler, or one political structure. That's the idea of Panhellenism. And it's debated how consciously Xenophon was playing into that idea when he wrote his account of the 10,000, but regardless of his intent, this is a fantastic story for serving an idea like that. Panhellenic army of mercenaries, stranded and vastly outnumbered, makes it to safety against all odds and in the process proves Greek superiority over the Persians. And I think this has a lot to do with why people focus on the part between Cunaxa and the Black Sea, and tend not to talk as much about the rest of it. I'm not trying to say that it's somehow dishonest to tell the story like this, by the way. Anybody who retells this story is going to have a purpose in mind for doing it, and they're going to tell the story in a way that serves that purpose. I don't think there's necessarily anything bad or nefarious in that on its own, but I do think seeing this contrast between what Xenophon wrote down originally and how the story gets remembered throughout the ages is illustrative of the idea of history as a story that serves a purpose. This idea of Panhellenism didn't come to its full fruition until about the mid-330s BC, about 65 years after the March of the 10,000, and it came at the hands of a somewhat unlikely source. If the Greek world was going to unify under anybody, you'd think it probably would have been either Athens or Sparta. After the Peloponnesian War, most likely Sparta. But it didn't turn out that way, and the Greek world in the end was unified under Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon. Macedon was an unlikely source for this because it was on the fringe of the Greek world, up in the northeast towards Thrace, and some people would probably have debated whether they were even Greek at all. But Philip was the one who finally accomplished that vision, and his son Alexander took that unified Greece into Persia as a conquering army, recalling Xenophon and the 10,000 as he did so. I'll read you the rest of the epilogue in the Landmark edition, picking up where I left off earlier. Quote, "The March of the 10,000 earned a special place in the minds of Greeks of the 4th century. The army's feat of marching into the king's heartland and returning as a unit, if a much depleted one, won them widespread admiration and offered inspiration for later expeditions to the east. Prior to the battle at Issus against the Persians in 333, Alexander the Great is said to have rallied his troops by reminding them of the achievement of Xenophon's men, who, he pointed out, were less in number and less complete as a fighting force, not even having cavalry for the battle in Babylonia. But even before Anabasis itself became available, the 10,000 were being held up as proof of Persian weakness and Greek power. According to Plutarch, the Spartans were spurred to their campaign in Asia by the Syrians' success, while Isocrates invokes them several times in his writings in support of a Panhellenic campaign against Persia. Let me sum up the whole matter, he writes in the Panegyrikos. These men did not set out to get plunder or to capture a town, but took the field against the king himself, and yet they returned in greater security than ambassadors who go to him on a friendly mission. That the memory of the event endured in public consciousness beyond the 4th century and the extraordinary successes of Alexander is a testament to its being on an important level a story of human triumph in the face of great adversity. Numerous references are made to the march through antiquity, perhaps most poignantly by the Roman general Mark Antony, whose huge army suffered great losses in a retreat through eastern Anatolia following a campaign against the Parthians in 36 BC. Seeing the suffering all around him, Antony is said to have often recalled the fortitude of the Greeks. Many perished thus, and the Parthians would not desist, and Antony, as we are told, would often cry, "Oh, the 10,000," thereby expressing his admiration of Xenophon's army, which made an even longer march to the sea from Babylon and fought with many times as many enemies, and yet came off safe. End quote. I also don't think this later disorder the army fell into takes anything away from the triumph of their even making it to the sea in the first place. Any way you slice that, it was a great accomplishment that came out of an impossible-looking scenario. In a way, the army's later internal squabbles are like a microcosm of the historic internal squabbles of the Greek world as a whole. And you could even argue that their tendency toward that stuff makes it all the more impressive that they were able to overcome it and work together as a unit when it really counted, long enough to preserve themselves and forge this epic story. There's at least 3 distinct things in history. There's what actually happened, there's what gets written down by the sources, and there's what gets remembered. I would argue that the truest sense of history is the last one, the memory. For a variety of reasons, maybe stemming somewhat from its usefulness to Pan-Hellenism, the memory of the 10,000 in the popular imagination over the millennia since has been primarily of the march from Cunaxa to the Black Sea. Of course, Pan-Hellenism was an idea that was very limited in place and time, and certainly by the time Rome rose to dominance in the Mediterranean, it was obsolete. But this particular cultural memory of the 10,000 endured, because it's just so compelling. If there had been a Nestor among the 10,000, I'm sure he would still have regaled Xenophon and the other generals with tales of the warriors of his generation and how they could throw stones that 4 men of Xenophon's day couldn't even lift. But I like to think that, in their older years, the survivors of the 10,000 had an achievement they could look back on with pride and claim worthiness to stand in the ranks alongside their great forefathers like Leonidas and Themistocles, Brasidas and Pericles. Might we all be so fortunate.